Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The wallpaper breathed. That was my first thought when I stepped into the Victorian Hotel's lobby in Hot Springs, Arkansas, though I immediately dismissed it as a trick of the gaslight-style fixtures casting their amber shadows across the burgundy damask patterns. The Crescent Moon Hotel stood like a monument to another century, its turrets and gables sharp against the October sky. I'd booked it for the thermal baths, for the promise of mineral waters that could ease the chronic pain in my shoulder, an old injury that flared up whenever stress got the better of me. The desk clerk, a woman whose age I couldn't place between 40 and 70, handed me an ornate brass key. Not a card, an actual key, heavy and cold. She mentioned something about the third floor being particularly quiet this time of year, that I'd have the run of it mostly to myself. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added that I should take the main staircase, rather than cutting through what she called the doll corridor after 10 at night. When I asked why, she merely smiled and suggested the lighting wasn't reliable in that wing. My room was precisely what I'd expected from the photographs online. Victorian excess in every carved wooden detail, from the four-poster bed to the clawfoot tub visible through the bathroom's open door. The thermal waters ran through pipes in the walls, the clerk had explained, keeping the building warm without modern heating. It created an odd sensation, as if the entire structure had a pulse, a circulation system of its own. That first night, I took dinner in the nearly empty dining room. Only 2 other tables were occupied, both by elderly couples who ate in silence. The waiter, a young man with nervous hands, kept glancing toward the corridor that led deeper into the hotel's east wing. When I asked about it, he stammered something about it being closed for renovation, though I could see no construction barriers or signs. By 11 o'clock, I was restless. The mineral bath had left me oddly energized rather than relaxed, my skin tingling with an almost electric sensation. The room felt smaller than it had earlier, the Victorian furniture crowding in like eager spectators. I decided to explore. The main hallway of the third floor stretched in both directions from my room, lit by replica gas lamps that created pools of light between longer stretches of shadow. To the west lay the main staircase and elevator. To the east, according to the brass placard on the wall, was the doll corridor and the hotel's historical wing. I went east. The transition was gradual, but unmistakable. The burgundy carpet gave way to a runner of deep green, the pattern beneath my feet shifting from geometric Victorian designs to something more organic, almost writhing. The walls held photographs in gilt frames, not of people, but of rooms. Empty rooms from different eras, each one containing a single piece of furniture or object positioned dead center. A rocking chair, a music box, a child's tea set arranged for invisible guests. The corridor bent at an unusual angle, not quite 90 degrees, creating a blind corner that seemed to swallow the light. The air grew thicker here, carrying a scent I couldn't identify, not quite mothballs, not quite dried flowers, but something between decay and preservation. Then I saw her. She moved like water, her navy blue dress rustling against the carpet with a sound like whispered secrets. The dress was authentic Victorian, I was certain. The bustle, the high collar, the countless buttons running down the back like a spine. She turned the corner ahead without looking back, without acknowledging my presence, though surely she must have heard my footsteps. I followed, my curiosity overriding the peculiar tightness in my chest. The corridor continued, longer than seemed possible given the hotel's exterior dimensions. More photographs lined the walls now, and in the dim light, I could swear the objects in them had shifted positions. The rocking chair mid-rock, the music box lid slightly open. She was always just ahead, turning corners I didn't remember approaching, her dress a blue shadow against the green carpet. No matter how I quickened my pace, the distance between us remained constant. The air grew colder despite the thermal pipes supposedly warming the walls. My breath came out in small puffs of vapor. Finally, she stopped at a door marked only with a brass number 7. The door was painted white, though age had turned it the color of old teeth. She placed her hand on the knob, and for the first time she turned her head slightly in my direction. Not enough to see her face, just enough to show the pale curve of her cheek, the dark arrangement of her hair pinned in an elaborate style no living woman would have the patience for. The door opened inward with a long, grieving creak. She entered. The door remained open. I approached slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorframe. The room beyond was wrong in ways my mind struggled to process. It was a child's nursery, but everything was slightly off scale. The crib too large, the rocking horse too small, the toys arranged on shelves that seemed to extend backward into impossible space. A mobile hung from the ceiling, its wooden figures spinning in a breeze that couldn't exist in a closed room. The woman stood beside a toy chest, her back to me, perfectly still. Too still, no rise and fall of breathing, no small movements that living bodies make unconsciously. Then came the whisper, not from her, but from everywhere and nowhere. Speak softly. He sleeps. The mobile spun faster. The toys on the shelves seemed to lean forward. The rocking horse began a slow, deliberate motion, and in the toy chest, something shifted. I backed out of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. The door swung shut with deliberate slowness, and I heard the distinct sound of a lock engaging from the inside. When I finally thought to look for the woman in the blue dress, the corridor was empty. I practically ran back to my room, taking wrong turns twice in corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. When I finally reached my door, my hands shook so badly I could barely manage the key. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair facing the door, watching the strip of light beneath it for shadows passing by. Occasionally, I heard footsteps in the corridor, not the solid tread of modern shoes, but the whisper of fabric against carpet. Once, near dawn, I could have sworn I heard a child's laughter, quickly hushed. The next morning, I went to the front desk to check out early. The same ageless woman was there, her smile sympathetic but unsurprised. As she processed my bill, I asked about room 7 in the East Wing. Her fingers paused on the keyboard. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, then pulled out a leather-bound ledger from beneath the desk, the kind hotels hadn't used for decades. She explained that room 7, the toy room, had been locked since 1953. A wealthy couple had stayed there with their young son. The boy had taken ill, one of those sudden Victorian-era deaths that no one talked about in detail. The parents had left everything behind, insisting the room remain untouched, paying for it in perpetuity through a trust. But sometimes, she admitted, guests reported finding it open. And when that happened, when someone witnessed what they shouldn't, the old reservation system, she gestured to the ledger, would show an extra night's stay. A charge that appeared in fading ink, in handwriting no one recognized, for a date that had already passed. The charge was never collected, she assured me, but it served as a reminder that some guests never truly checked out. I asked who the woman in the blue dress was, describing her in detail. The clerk's smile faltered. She showed me a photograph from the 1890s, the hotel's opening year. Among the staff was a governess in a navy blue dress, hired to watch the children of wealthy guests. She had disappeared one night, along with a young boy in her charge. They found the boy 3 days later, sleeping in room 7, with no memory of where he'd been. The governess was never found. But here's what the clerk didn't tell me, what I discovered only after I'd left, after I'd researched the hotel's history in the safety of my apartment hundreds of miles away. Room 7 had been many things over the decades. A nursery, yes, but also a storage room, a guest room, even a small library. Its purpose seemed to shift based on who was looking for it, what they expected to find. The trust that paid for the room. It had been established in 1898, 55 years before the incident the clerk described. The signatures on the documents were illegible. The bank account it drew from untraceable. The payments arrived monthly, in cash, in envelopes with no return address but postmarked from Hot Springs. I found other accounts too, buried in forums and blog posts that disappeared days after I bookmarked them. Guests who'd seen the woman in blue, who'd found room 7 open, who'd heard the whispered warning about someone sleeping. The details varied. Sometimes it was a study full of medical equipment, sometimes a seamstress's workshop with mannequins that looked too lifelike. But always, there was the extra charge, the night that somehow added itself to their stay. My bank statement arrived 2 weeks later. There was indeed an extra charge from the hotel, but not for a room. It was itemized as extended corridor access and dated not for a day during my stay, but for October 7th, 1898. The date meant nothing to me until I found it in an old newspaper archive. October 7th, 1898. Mysterious illness strikes Crescent Moon Hotel. 7 guests report vivid nightmares and temporary paralysis after venturing into East Wing after midnight. Hotel management considering permanent closure of affected corridor. The corridor was never closed, or perhaps it was, and what I walked through was something else entirely. A space between spaces that opens when the thermal waters run particularly hot, when the minerals in the air create just the right conditions for certain boundaries to thin. I still dream about it sometimes. Not nightmares exactly, but dreams where I'm walking those corridors again, following the woman in blue, approaching that door. In the dreams, I always enter the room. In the dreams, I see what's in the toy chest. In the dreams, I understand who's sleeping and why he must never wake. But I wake before I can remember what I've learned. I wake with my shoulder aching, the old injury flaring as if I've been carrying something heavy. I wake to find toys I don't remember buying arranged on my nightstand. A wooden top, a tin soldier, a child's compass that always points toward Arkansas. The compass is the worst part, because sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I watch its needle quiver and swing, and I know with absolute certainty that it's not pointing toward Arkansas at all. It's pointing toward Room 7, wherever Room 7 happens to be tonight, and growing closer. Story 2. The peanut shells shouldn't have been there. I've been working events at the Whitmore estate for 3 years now, and I know every inch of this sprawling Detroit mansion-turned-museum like the veins on the back of my hands. The East Wing staircase has been cordoned off since 1987, something about structural integrity, though the mahogany banister still gleams like it did when the Otto Baron's family lived here a century ago. Yellow rope barriers and a stern staff-only sign keep visitors away during our charity galas and corporate functions. No one goes there. Ever. Yet there they were. 3 perfect peanut shells on the landing, arranged in a neat little triangle like someone had been sitting there, cracking them open with methodical precision. It was past midnight, and I was doing my final sweep after the MS Foundation benefit. The ballroom had emptied hours ago, leaving behind the usual debris: champagne flutes with lipstick marks, crumpled napkins, a forgotten earring glinting under a chair. The catering crew had packed up their gear and vanished into the October night. Even my supervisor had left, trusting me to lock up alone as usual. The shells crackled under my work boots as I bent to sweep them into my dustpan. That's when I heard it. Soft footsteps ascending behind me, each tread creaking with familiar precision. I know those sounds. This old wood has its own language, and after 3 years, I'm fluent. Someone was definitely climbing the stairs. I turned, expecting to find a drunk guest who'd somehow wandered back in, or maybe the night security guard doing his rounds early. The staircase stretched down into shadow, empty. The footsteps continued, growing closer. I could feel the vibration through the floorboards, could hear the whisper of fabric against the wall. Then came another sound that made my skin prickle. The wet, deliberate crunch of someone biting into something crisp and juicy. The dustpan clattered from my hand, shells scattering across the Persian runner. I backed against the wall, my breath coming in sharp bursts that fogged in the suddenly frigid air. The footsteps stopped 3 stairs below me. The chewing continued, slow, savoring. I could hear the saliva, the careful mastication, even a soft hum of satisfaction. The sound was so close I should have felt breath on my face, should have smelled whatever was being eaten. Instead, there was only the musty scent of old wood and furniture polish, and a faint sweetness I couldn't place. I ran. Not walked, not hurried. Ran like a child fleeing nightmares, taking the steps 3 at a time until I burst into the safety of the main hall. My hands shook as I fumbled with the alarm code, and I left without finishing my duties. The next morning, I arrived early, determined to prove to myself that exhaustion had played tricks on my mind. My supervisor was already there, frowning at his tablet in the security office. "We need to check the east wing," he said without preamble. Motion sensors went crazy around midnight. "You see anything unusual last night?" I kept my voice steady, professional. "Just mentioned finding some peanut shells on the restricted staircase, probably from a wayward guest." He nodded, already pulling up the infrared footage on his screen. The timestamp read 12:47 a.m. There I was in ghostly white thermal imaging, bending to collect the shells. The camera angle showed the entire staircase behind me, completely empty. But as I straightened, the doorknob to the second-floor storage room began to turn. Slowly, deliberately, making a full rotation before stopping. No heat signature, no figure. Just the knob moving in the mechanical, purposeful way someone tests a lock. My supervisor rewound the footage, enhanced it. In the stained glass window at the landing, a Victorian piece depicting autumn harvest scenes, something else appeared, a reflection that shouldn't exist from that angle. A pale shape that might have been a hand, holding what looked like a small, round object. It moved when I moved, stopped when I stopped, but always remained just out of sync, like an echo arriving too late. "Probably just thermal distortion," my supervisor muttered, but his voice carried no conviction. He knew this equipment. He'd installed it himself. Thermal distortion doesn't turn doorknobs. That's when I made my first mistake. I started leaving things. It began innocently enough, a few peanuts on the bottom step just to see. They were gone by morning, replaced by shells arranged in that same perfect triangle. Then I got bolder. A candy bar, an apple, a sandwich cut diagonally, the way my mother used to make them. Each offering vanished, leaving behind traces. Wrapper folded into impossibly small origami shapes. Apple cores carved with delicate patterns. Bread crusts arranged to spell words I couldn't quite read before they crumbled at my touch. The building felt different during my night shifts. Warmer in spots where it should be cold, freezing in places near the heating vents. I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, quick darts of shadow that resolved into nothing when I turned. The staircase began to creak at predictable times. 9:17 p.m., 11:43 p.m., 2:26 a.m. Always the same pattern of footsteps, always stopping just out of sight. 3 weeks into this dance, I brought a caramel apple. I'd bought it from the farmer's market, a beautiful thing covered in chopped pecans and drizzled with chocolate. I placed it carefully on the banister post at exactly 9:00 p.m., then retreated to the security office to watch through the cameras. Nothing happened for hours. I dozed off around 1 a.m., waking to find static filling every monitor. When the feeds restored at 1:47 a.m., the apple was gone. In its place, a perfect circle of caramel residue, as if the apple had melted into the wood itself, leaving only its sweet ghost behind. But it was the note that made me call in sick for 3 days. Letters cut from an old program, the kind they used to print for the mansion's grand parties in the 1920s, spelled out a message in fonts from another era. Perdi a hora de novo. I don't speak Portuguese, but Google Translate provided the answer that made my stomach drop. Lost track of time again. My research became obsessive. I spent hours in the Detroit Public Library, combing through newspaper archives and historical records. The Whitmore estate had its share of tragedy. What old mansion doesn't? But one story stood out. October 1923, a young Brazilian pianist hired to perform at a harvest gala. The society pages mentioned him briefly. A prodigy who'd traveled from São Paulo to study at the Detroit Conservatory. He'd been the talk of the season, charming hostesses with his old-world manners and appetite for American sweets, particularly the caramel apples sold by street vendors. The article stopped abruptly after October 31st. No mention of his performance. No record of him returning to Brazil. Just a small notice 2 weeks later about the East Wing staircase being closed for renovations that seemed to have never quite finished. I found one photograph from that harvest gala, yellowed and brittle, a crowd of revelers in elaborate costumes, and in the corner, barely visible, a young man in a simple black suit, standing alone by the East Wing entrance. He held something round in his hand, and his mouth was open, as if caught mid-bite. But his eyes were looking directly at the camera with an expression I recognized, the look of someone who knew they were running out of time. Last night I brought another caramel apple. I also brought a 1923 program from the Harvest Gala, purchased from an antique dealer for more than I could afford. I placed both on the banister and spoke to the empty staircase. I know you're here. I know you're hungry. I know you're lost. The temperature plummeted so fast my breath came out in clouds. The footsteps started immediately, not climbing this time, but pacing, back and forth on the landing, agitated. The sound of chewing became almost frantic, wet and desperate. Then, for the first time, I heard something else. Music. Faint piano notes drifting from everywhere and nowhere. A waltz in a minor key that made my chest ache with inexplicable homesickness. The pacing stopped. The music stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard paper rustling. When I looked down, the program was open to the schedule of events. October 31st, 1923, 11:30 p.m., special performance by visiting artist. But someone had written in the margin with what looked like caramel, letters barely visible in the dim light. Still waiting for my turn. The apple remained untouched. The presence, whatever it was, felt different. Expectant. I understood then that it wasn't just hungry for food. It was hungry for its moment, for the performance that never happened, for the time that had slipped away like candy melting through fingers. I should have left then. Should have quit this job, moved to another city, forgotten about the Whitmore estate and its permanent guest. But I didn't. Because now, every night at 11:30, I set up a single chair at the foot of the East Wing staircase. I leave a caramel apple on the seat and wait. Sometimes I hear the piano. Sometimes just the footsteps, circling endlessly like a performer preparing for an entrance that never comes. Sometimes I find peanut shells arranged in patterns that look almost like musical notes. And sometimes, when the moonlight hits the stained glass just right, I see him in the reflection. Forever young, forever hungry, forever about to begin. The other night, I brought my phone and played a recording of Chopin's Waltz in a Minor. The footsteps stopped. The air grew warm. And for just a moment, I could have sworn I smelled caramel apples and heard applause echoing from somewhere deep in the walls. This morning, I found something new. Not a note, not shells, but a single piano key, ivory, yellowed with age, placed precisely where I'd left the apple. When I picked it up, it was warm to the touch, and my fingers came away sticky with caramel. I've started learning piano. It feels important, though I can't say why. My teacher says I have unusual dedication for a beginner, practicing the same waltz over and over, until my fingers know every note. She doesn't need to know that sometimes, during my night shifts, I hear someone playing along with me from a piano that was removed from the mansion decades ago. The East Wing staircase remains officially closed. The yellow rope barriers stay in place. The staff-only sign continues to deter visitors. But every night at 11:30 I leave my post and stand at the foot of those stairs. I leave a caramel apple. I wait. Because I've come to understand something about time in this place. It doesn't flow normally here. It pools and eddies, catches on certain moments like cloth on a nail. And maybe, just maybe, if I wait long enough, if I bring enough apples, if I learn the right waltz, time might unhook itself just enough to let a young pianist finally take his bow. Or maybe I'm losing my mind, one peanut shell at a time. The distinction matters less with each passing night. The footsteps have become familiar, almost comforting. The phantom chewing no longer frightens me. Even the infrared cameras, with their impossible reflections and mysterious movements, seem less like evidence of haunting and more like glimpses into a performance that refuses to end. My supervisor mentioned yesterday that I looked tired, that I should take some time off. But October 31st is coming, the anniversary. Something tells me this year will be different. This year, the performance might finally happen. I've been preparing. I've learned the waltz. I've stockpiled caramel apples. I've even found a vintage evening jacket at a thrift store, the kind a gentleman might wear to a 1923 harvest gala. The note I found this morning, spelled out in peanut shells on my car windshield, seems to confirm my suspicion. Almost time. I don't know what happens when a century-old performance finally takes place. I don't know if I'll be the audience or part of the show, but I know I'll be there, at the foot of the East Wing staircase, when the clock strikes 11:30 on Halloween night. The apple I leave tonight will be perfect, covered in pecans, drizzled with chocolate, wrapped in cellophane that catches the light like stained glass. And maybe, just maybe, this time when I hear those footsteps descending, I'll finally see who's been keeping me company all these nights. Or maybe I'll become another story for someone else to discover in the archives, another unexplained disappearance, another reason to keep the East Wing stairs closed, another hungry ghost waiting for the perfect moment that never quite arrives. Either way, I can't stop now. The performance must go on, even if it's 100 years late. Story 3. The headlights cut through Appalachian darkness like dull knives through tar, barely making a dent in the wall of black that pressed against our rental car from all sides. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as we wound through another hairpin turn, the GPS signal flickering in and out like a dying heartbeat. My two colleagues, I'll call them the believer and the skeptic, had been arguing about local folklore for the past hour, their voices rising and falling with the mountain roads. We were supposed to be documenting rural legends for the university's anthropology department, but what started as academic curiosity had twisted into something else entirely. The believer had heard about this particular bridge from a gas station attendant 30 miles back, an old man whose milky eyes had widened when we mentioned we were collecting stories. He'd leaned across the counter, tobacco-stained fingers trembling as he drew us a map on the back of a receipt. The bridge appeared suddenly in our high beams, a narrow span of rusted iron and weathered wood that seemed to hover over a gorge so deep, the darkness below looked solid. I slowed the car to a crawl, tires crunching on loose gravel. The skeptic laughed nervously from the back seat, but it came out hollow, swallowed immediately by the pressing silence outside. According to the legend, if you stopped your car in the middle of the bridge at exactly 3:33 a.m. and turned off the engine, something would breathe in your ear. Just breathe. Nothing more, nothing less. But that breath, the old man had insisted while avoiding our eyes, that breath would change you. He wouldn't say how. My dashboard clock read 3:31 a.m. The believer was practically vibrating with anticipation, his phone already recording, the screen's glow making his face look carved from wax. The skeptic had gone quiet, and I could see his reflection in the rearview mirror, jaw clenched tight. As for me, I felt a strange detachment, as if I were watching myself from somewhere above, observing three fools about to test something they didn't understand. I rolled the car to the bridge's exact center. You could tell by the way the boards groaned differently there, a deeper sound, almost melodic. The engine's rumble vibrated through the chassis and into my bones. Through the windshield, I could see nothing but black. No stars, no moon, just an absence that seemed to pull at my eyes. 3:32 a.m. The believer whispered that we should open the windows for the full experience. The skeptic protested, but his voice cracked. I found myself reaching for the window controls before I'd made a conscious decision. All four windows descended with a mechanical whir, and immediately the car filled with the scent of wet earth and something else. Something organic and old, like mushrooms growing in forgotten corners. The mountain air was warmer than it should have been for October, thick and humid, coating the inside of my throat with each breath. Somewhere far below, water moved over rocks, but the sound was distorted, coming from impossible directions, sometimes from directly above us. 3:33 a.m. I turned the key. The engine died with a shudder that ran through the entire frame of the car. The headlights flickered once, twice, then went dark. The silence that followed wasn't really silence. It was an active thing, pressing against my eardrums, making them ache with phantom pressure. We sat there, three grown men afraid to breathe too loudly. The believer's phone screen had gone dark to save battery, and without it, the darkness was complete. I couldn't see my hands on the steering wheel. I couldn't see anything at all. That's when the temperature began to drop. It started at my feet, a creeping cold that climbed up my legs like water filling a tank. But this wasn't the clean cold of winter. This was something wet, something that seeped through clothes and skin and settled in the marrow. My breath started coming out in visible puffs, though I couldn't see them so much as feel them, ice crystals forming on my lips. The believer made a sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a whimper. The skeptic's breathing had gone rapid and shallow. And me? I sat frozen, not from cold but from a certainty that had materialized in my mind without explanation. We were no longer alone in the car. The presence didn't announce itself with sound or movement. It was simply there, occupying the space between us, around us, through us. The air grew thick, syrupy, hard to pull into lungs that suddenly felt too small. My skin prickled with the sensation of being observed, no, examined, by something that existed outside my understanding of space. Then came the breath. It started behind my right ear, a long, sustained exhalation that seemed to go on far longer than any human lung capacity would allow. But calling it human would be wrong. This breath had texture, weight, intelligence. It vibrated through my skull, down my spine, making the car seat tremor beneath me. The sound, if you could call it a sound, existed somewhere between a frequency and a feeling, bypassing my ears entirely and manifesting directly in my nervous system. The breath carried something with it. Not words, but information. Images that weren't images, memories that weren't mine, knowledge that my brain couldn't quite process but couldn't reject either. I saw, felt new things about the bridge, about the gap between spaces, about the things that breathe in places where breathing shouldn't be possible. My hands moved without my permission, reaching for the ignition. But as my fingers found the key, I noticed the dashboard. The speedometer needle was swaying back and forth, a lazy pendulum marking speeds we weren't traveling. 20, 40, 60 miles per hour, while we sat perfectly still. Or were we still? The sensation of movement crept up my spine, not forward or backward, but sideways, through dimensions I couldn't name. The believer was trying to speak, but his words came out as vapor, crystallizing in the air and falling like snow onto the dashboard. The skeptic had pressed himself against his door, and I could hear his fingernails scratching against the handle, a rhythmic sound that matched neither his breathing nor mine. I turned the key. The engine roared to life with more force than it should have, headlights blazing so bright that for a moment the world went white instead of black. The radio, which had been off, I was certain it had been off, burst into static. But through the white noise, stretched and distorted like taffy being pulled, came a single vowel sound. The same tone, the same duration as the breath that had touched my neck. Ah! I slammed the car into drive and floored it. The tires screamed against wood and metal as we shot forward, the bridge seeming to stretch impossibly long before us. In the rearview mirror, darkness pursued us like a living thing, and for one horrible second, I swear I saw it breathing, expanding and contracting like massive lungs. We didn't stop driving until dawn, didn't speak until we'd put 3 counties between us and that bridge. When we finally pulled into a diner parking lot, all 3 of us stumbled out on shaking legs. The believer's phone, when he finally checked it, had no recording. The entire video file was corrupted, showing only a single frame, a still image of the car's interior, but with 4 people visible in the reflection of the windshield. The skeptic quit the project that day, transferred to a different department within a week. The believer became obsessed, returning to the area again and again, though he could never find the bridge a second time. The maps showed no bridge in that location. The GPS data from that night was scrambled, showing us in 12 different places simultaneously. And me? I still drive, still travel these mountain roads for research. But something fundamental changed that night. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my car, I'll feel that breath on my neck again. Not threatening, just present, watching, waiting. The worst part, or perhaps the best, I can't decide anymore, is what happens with the radio. Every car I've driven since that night does the same thing. At 3:33 a.m., regardless of whether it's on or off, the radio produces that same stretched vowel sound. That same tone that matches something deep in my chest. A resonance I didn't know existed until that night on the bridge. I've had my hearing checked multiple times. The doctors find nothing wrong, though one specialist mentioned something odd. My eardrums show microscopic scarring in a pattern he'd never seen before, almost like sound waves had been physically etched into the tissue. He asked if I'd been exposed to experimental frequencies. I told him no. Last week, I discovered something that made me question everything about that night. I was digitizing old department files when I found a report from 1978. 3 graduate students had documented a legend about a bridge in Appalachian, North Carolina. They'd tested it, stopping their car at 3:33 a.m. Only 2 students returned. The third, they claimed, had simply vanished from the back seat while something breathed in the darkness. The authorities found no evidence of foul play, no body, no explanation. The 2 survivors were never quite able to agree on what happened, their stories shifting with each telling. The missing student's name was redacted in the official report, but a handwritten note in the margin gave his first name. It was mine. I've checked the records. There's no connection, no relation, no explanation for the coincidence. But sometimes coincidences aren't coincidences at all. Sometimes their patterns we're not equipped to understand, geometries that exist outside our 3-dimensional thinking. These days I find myself drawn back to those mountain roads. Not to find the bridge, I know better than that now, but to feel the pull of it, the way it tugs at something behind my sternum. The breath hasn't returned, not fully, but I can feel it waiting, patient as geology, inevitable as gravity. My colleagues, new ones, who don't know about that night, have noticed changes in me. They say I pause mid-sentence sometimes, head tilted as if listening to something only I can hear. They're not wrong. There's a frequency now, always present, like tinnitus, but more purposeful. It grows stronger near certain places, old bridges, abandoned tunnels, spaces where the modern world wears thin. I've started keeping a journal, documenting not what I see but what I feel in these places. The entries are becoming less coherent, filled with diagrams I don't remember drawing, equations that use symbols I didn't know I knew. Last night I found a full page covered in a single word, written over and over in my handwriting but at angles that hurt to look at. Breathing. The rational part of my mind, the part that earned a PhD, that publishes papers in peer-reviewed journals, knows this could all be psychological. Mass hysteria, shared delusion, some kind of acoustic phenomenon that triggered a neurological response. That's what I tell myself during daylight hours, surrounded by the comforting bustle of campus life. But at night, alone with the memory of that breath, I know better. Something touched us on that bridge, marked us, changed us in ways we're only beginning to understand. The believer was right about one thing. The breath does change you. Not all at once, but slowly, like erosion, wearing away the barriers between what you know and what you suspect. I still have the receipt with the old man's map. Sometimes I study it, looking for patterns in the shaky lines, coordinates in the coffee stains. The bridge is there, I know it is. Not on any official map, not in any GPS database, but in the spaces between, in the moments between 3:32 and 3:34, in the pause between exhalation and inhalation. Tomorrow I'm driving back to those mountains, alone this time. Not to test the legend again, once was enough, more than enough, but to understand what I'm becoming, what we all became that night when something breathed across the gap between worlds. The radio in my car has started picking up signals from stations that don't exist, voices speaking in languages that predate speech. I know I should be afraid. The old me would have been terrified. But fear requires a belief that what you're experiencing is wrong, unnatural, threatening. What I feel now is different. It's recognition. It's coming home to a place you've never been but always belonged. The breathing bridge is still out there, suspended between mountains and mist. between reality and whatever lies beneath it. And sometimes, in the hours before dawn when the world is at its thinnest, I can feel it breathing still. Not just the bridge, the whole mountain range, the earth itself, inhaling and exhaling in rhythms too vast for human comprehension. We were never meant to hear that breath. But now that we have, we can never unhear it. It's become part of our frequency, our resonance. We're tuning forks struck by something infinite, still vibrating with a note that has no name. The skeptic called me last month, first time since he quit. His voice was different, hollow, echoing like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. He'd started hearing the breathing too, he said, started feeling the pull. He asked if I thought we'd actually left the bridge that night, or if some part of us was still there, still sitting in that cold car while something impossible breathed against our necks. I couldn't answer him, because sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see 4 reflections where there should be one, and one of them is still sitting in that car, key turned, engine dead, waiting for a breath that's already come and gone and coming still. Story 4. The glass cases on the second floor of the St. Joseph Psychiatric Museum held more than just artifacts. They held reflections that shouldn't exist. I'd arrived at the museum on a Tuesday morning in October, when the autumn light filtered weakly through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the institutional green walls. My assignment was straightforward: photograph the new exhibition on early 20th century treatment methods for a medical history journal. The editor had specifically requested atmospheric shots that captured what she called the haunting beauty of medical progress. If she only knew how literal that description would become. The museum occupied the east wing of what had been Missouri's second largest psychiatric hospital, operational from 1874 to 1997. Most of the complex had been demolished or converted into condominiums, but this wing remained preserved, its original terrazzo floors and heavy wooden doors intact. The smell hit you first, that peculiar mixture of old wood, industrial disinfectant, and something else. Something organic and faintly sweet that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. I started on the ground floor, methodically photographing the reception area, with its curved desk and faded admission ledgers displayed under protective glass. The morning security guard, a heavy-set man in his 60s with rheumy eyes, watched me work without comment. He sat behind the desk reading a paperback novel, occasionally glancing up when my camera's shutter clicked. The silence in the building was absolute, broken only by the mechanical hum of the climate control system and the distant sound of traffic outside. The first floor exhibition rooms contained the expected items: restraint devices, early electroshock therapy equipment, bottles of long discontinued medications with names like Thorazine and Malaril. I photographed each display case carefully, adjusting my angles to minimize glare from the overhead fluorescence. Everything proceeded normally until I climbed the worn marble stairs to the second floor. The atmosphere changed immediately. The temperature dropped at least 10 degrees, and the quality of light shifted from the warm yellows of the first floor to something grayer, more diffuse. The hallway stretched before me, lined with more display cases, but these contained personal effects of former patients: photographs, handwritten journals, pieces of artwork created during art therapy sessions. The intimacy of these objects felt invasive, as if I were peering through windows into private suffering. I began photographing a case containing a patient's drawings, disturbing images of faces with too many eyes, buildings that seemed to fold in on themselves, human figures whose proportions were subtly but profoundly wrong. As I adjusted my camera settings, I noticed it in the glass reflection. A dark shape behind me, roughly human in form but truncated at the neck, as if someone had taken scissors to a photograph and removed the head. The figure was impossibly black, not merely dark, but an absence of light, like staring into a cave mouth at midnight. My first instinct was to spin around, but the hallway behind me was empty. Just the institutional green walls, the scuffed linoleum floor, the fluorescent lights humming in their fixtures. I turned back to the case. The figure remained in the reflection, perhaps 3 feet behind me, perfectly still. Pareidolia, I told myself. The mind's tendency to see patterns, especially human forms, where none exist. The angle of the light, the imperfections in the old glass, my own reflection creating an optical illusion. I raised my hand to the glass, intending to change the angle and dispel the image. When my finger made contact with the surface, cold shot through my hand like I'd pressed it against dry ice. The sensation was so intense, so localized, that I jerked back involuntarily. A thin line of frost had formed on the glass where I'd touched it, spiraling outward in a delicate pattern before evaporating. The figure in the reflection hadn't moved. I backed away from the case, my camera hanging heavy around my neck, every piece of glass on the second floor, every display case, every framed photograph, every window, showed the same reflection. The headless figure, always behind me, always at the same distance no matter how I moved. When I stopped, it stopped. When I walked, it followed, maintaining that precise 3-foot gap. The rational part of my mind cycled through explanations. Carbon monoxide leak causing hallucinations. Mold in the old building triggering neurological responses. Stress from the assignment manifesting as visual disturbances. But the cold was real. I could see my breath now, small puffs of vapor in the suddenly frigid air. I descended to the first floor, trying to maintain a steady pace, fighting the urge to run. The security guard looked up from his book as I approached his desk. His expression shifted from boredom to concern, and he set the paperback aside. "You feeling all right?" His voice was gravelly, probably from decades of cigarettes. "You look pale." I started to explain about the reflection, the cold, but the words seemed absurd in the normal light of the lobby. Instead, I asked if anyone else had reported anything unusual on the second floor. He studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "The second floor does that sometimes. The reflection thing. Cold spots. Been happening for years, ever since they opened the museum." He pulled open a desk drawer and retrieved a worn notebook, its pages yellowed with age. "We're supposed to log it when it happens. Management says it's just the old HVAC system and window angles, but..." He trailed off, flipping through pages covered in dates and brief descriptions. But what? "When it happens, when people see the reflection and feel the cold, the elevator acts up, gets stuck between floors for a few seconds, usually opens on the wrong floor. The basement, specifically, where the morgue used to be." He closed the notebook. "Of course, that's just coincidence. Old building, old elevator. These things happen." I wanted to leave then, to pack up my equipment and tell the editor I'd gotten food poisoning or my camera had malfunctioned. But professional pride won out. I still had half the second floor to photograph, and the third floor after that. I convinced myself that knowing what to expect would make it easier to ignore. The second floor hadn't warmed in my absence. The figure remained in every reflection. That darkness where a head should be somehow more disturbing than any face could have been. I forced myself to work methodically, framing each shot, adjusting the exposure, ignoring the presence that lurked in every piece of glass. My fingers grew numb from the cold, making it difficult to operate the camera controls. In the last room on the second floor, I found a display dedicated to a particular patient, admitted in 1953. The placard gave only initials, RM, and basic information. Admitted for persistent delusions of a persecutory nature, underwent insulin shock therapy, hydrotherapy, prolonged isolation. The photographs showed a young man, perhaps 25, with hollow eyes and sharp cheekbones. In each successive photo, taken over his 7 years at the hospital, he appeared more gaunt, more absent, as if something was slowly erasing him from the inside out. The final photograph showed him shortly before his death in 1960. The placard noted he died of complications from treatment, a euphemism that could mean anything. But it was his expression in that last photo that made me step closer to the case. He was looking directly at the camera, but his eyes seemed focused on something behind the photographer, something that filled him with a terror so complete it had moved beyond fear into a kind of vacant acceptance. When I raised my camera to photograph the display, the reflection in the glass shifted. The headless figure was no longer behind me. It stood beside me, one dark arm extended toward my shoulder. I could feel the cold radiating from where it should have been touching me, a burning freeze that penetrated through my jacket and shirt. The camera slipped from my numb fingers, saved only by the strap around my neck. I left the second floor without finishing the documentation. In the elevator, I pressed the button for the third floor, needing to complete at least that portion of the assignment before leaving. The elevator rose smoothly, the floor indicator climbing. 1, 2. The machinery ground to a halt. The lights flickered. For 7 seconds, I counted them, each one stretching like an eternity. The elevator hung suspended. Then it lurched into motion, but downward. The doors opened onto darkness. The basement stretched before me, lit only by emergency lighting that cast sickly green shadows. I could make out metal tables, drainage channels in the floor, the distinctive Y-shaped outline of an autopsy table. The morgue, preserved exactly as it had been when the hospital closed. The cold here was different from the second floor, older, deeper, carrying with it the memory of refrigeration units and preserved flesh. I jabbed repeatedly at the elevator buttons, but the doors remained open. From somewhere in the darkness came a sound like rustling paper, or perhaps dried leaves, or perhaps skin brushing against metal. The emergency lights began to flicker in sequence, starting from the far end of the morgue and moving toward the elevator, each one dimming as the next began to strobe. In the stuttering light, I saw movement, shapes that might have been shadows cast by the unstable lighting, or might have been something else entirely. They moved with purpose, converging on the elevator from multiple directions. The rustling sound grew louder, multiplied, became a chorus of whispers just below the threshold of comprehension. The elevator doors finally responded, closing with agonizing slowness. As they sealed, I glimpsed something in the narrowing gap. A face, or what had once been a face, pressed against the elevator doors from the outside. Features that were almost human, but wrong in every particular, as if someone had tried to reconstruct a person from memory and gotten the proportions subtly, horribly incorrect. The elevator rose to the lobby. I stumbled out, past the security guard who called out something I didn't register, and into the October sunlight. My hands shook as I loaded my equipment into the car. I had enough photographs for the article, I told myself. The editor would have to be satisfied with what I'd captured. But when I reviewed the images that evening, I found something that made my blood turn to ice. In every photograph from the second floor, in every reflection in every piece of glass, the headless figure appeared. But it wasn't following me. In each image, it stood in exactly the same position, 3 feet behind where the photographer would be standing. And in the metadata, the GPS coordinates were all wrong. They showed the photographs had been taken in the basement. I've tried to convince myself it was a technical glitch, that the museum structure interfered with the GPS signal, that the reflections were tricks of light and glass. But sometimes, in my peripheral vision, I catch glimpses of darkness where heads should be. In windows, in mirrors, in the black screen of my computer before it boots up. Always 3 feet behind me, always waiting. The security guard called me a week later. His voice was strained, uncertain. The elevator had been acting up more frequently since my visit, he said, opening on the basement level when no one had pressed for it, and sometimes, late in the day when the museum was closing, he could hear the shutter of a camera clicking from the second floor, even though he'd confirmed the floor was empty. He asked if I'd noticed anything unusual in my photographs. I told him no. Everything was normal, just typical museum documentation. He seemed relieved, but before hanging up, he mentioned one more thing. They'd found an old employee record while renovating a storage room. A photographer hired in 1960 to document the hospital for medical journals. He'd fallen down the elevator shaft during his assignment, landing in the morgue. The impact had been fatal, nearly decapitating him. The photographer's initials were RM, the same as the patient whose display I'd photographed, the same patient who died of complications from treatment. I've stopped taking photographs professionally. I can't trust what the camera sees anymore, can't distinguish between what's real and what's reflection. The images from the museum assignment were never published. I told the editor my memory card had corrupted, that all the files were lost. She was disappointed, but understanding. These things happen with digital media, but late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment, I sometimes open the files on my computer. I study each image, looking for something I might have missed, some detail that would explain everything rationally. And in the glow of the monitor, I see it reflected in my glasses, in the glossy surface of my desk, in every reflective surface around me. The headless figure, still 3 feet behind me, still waiting. I've researched the museum extensively since my visit. The psychiatric hospital had a reputation for experimental treatments, for pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable, even by the loose standards of mid-century psychiatry. Patients who complained of being watched, of seeing things that weren't there, of feeling presences in empty rooms. They were subjected to increasingly aggressive interventions. The treatments were meant to eliminate delusions, to restore rational thought. But what if the patients weren't delusional? What if the hospital, with its history of suffering and death, had become a kind of psychic sinkhole, a place where the boundary between perception and reality had worn thin? What if the treatments hadn't cured anything but had instead trapped both patients and staff in an endless loop of observation and documentation, photographer and subject merged into something that could only exist in reflection? I don't have answers. I only know that every piece of glass has become a window into something I don't want to see but can't stop looking for. The figure is always there, patient and permanent, a darkness where illumination should be. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the one following it, if I've been walking 3 feet behind all along, and what I see in the glass is simply the truth viewed from the wrong direction. The museum remains open. People visit every day, taking pictures, studying the displays, learning about the history of psychiatric treatment. Most see nothing unusual, but occasionally, someone will hurry out, pale and shaken, claiming the second floor is too cold, that something feels wrong. The security guard logs these incidents in his notebook, adding to the growing record of anomalies that management attributes to imagination and old building syndrome. I know better, but knowledge doesn't change anything. The reflection remains, constant as shadow, patient as death, waiting in every piece of glass for someone else to notice, to reach out and touch the cold surface, to feel that ice-burn recognition that some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed, and some treatments never really end. Story 5. The porcelain sang before it fell. That's what I keep telling myself anyway. Porcelain sings. A high crystalline note when it's about to crack. Physics. Thermal expansion. Nothing supernatural about a heavy vase deciding to take a midnight stroll across my sideboard and crash to the floor the exact moment my fingertips found the light switch. But physics doesn't explain the laughter. I've been head chef at Delacroix Bistro for 8 months now, long enough to know every creak in these century-old floorboards, every whisper of wind through the gaps in the original brickwork. The building's history seeps through the walls like moisture. This place was once Madame Evangeline's, a high-end brothel that catered to politicians and oil barons back when New Orleans still pretended to have shame about such things. The brass nameplate by the kitchen door still bears traces of the old establishment. Private Dining Room 3. I've scrubbed at the engraving countless times, but the letters refuse to fade completely. Some stains run deeper than surface cleaning can reach. Last Tuesday, I stayed late to inventory supplies. The dining room had been empty for hours, chairs stacked on tables like sleeping sentinels, the air thick with the lingering scent of today's special, bourbon-glazed duck with dirty rice. I was making final notes on my clipboard when the sound started. A soft, rhythmic scraping, like someone dragging their fingernails along wood. My pen stopped moving. The sound was coming from the sideboard, the mahogany monstrosity that dominates the far wall, probably original to the building. Heavy enough to require 4 men to move, laden with our best china and crystal. The scraping grew louder, more deliberate. I approached slowly, my footsteps muffled by the Persian rug that covers the warped planks beneath. The sideboard looked innocent enough in the dim light, its carved gargoyles grinning their eternal grins. But something was wrong with the positioning of the items on top. The blue willow vase, the one Delacroix's grandmother brought from Marseille, had moved at least 6 inches from its usual spot near the left gargoyle's wing. My hand moved toward the light switch out of habit, muscle memory from hundreds of closing routines. The moment my fingers made contact with the worn brass plate, the vase slid smoothly across the polished wood surface, accelerating as if pulled by an invisible string, and launched itself into the air. Time stretched like taffy. I watched it arc through the darkness, a pale blur against the burgundy wallpaper, before exploding against the hardwood floor in a symphony of destruction. Porcelain shards scattered like fallen stars, catching what little light bled through the shuttered windows. And in that crystalline moment of impact, something laughed, not a human laugh. Too breathy, too hollow, like air escaping from a punctured lung, shaped into mirth. The sound lasted exactly 3 seconds. I counted them off in my hammering heartbeat, before silence reclaimed the room. I swept up the pieces by the light of my phone's flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I had to restart twice. Each shard felt unnaturally cold, as if the porcelain had been stored in a freezer. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was a stress reaction. Too many 16-hour days, too much caffeine, too little sleep. The human brain creates patterns where none exist, finds faces in wallpaper and voices in white noise. The explanation felt solid until I found the recording on my phone. I'd been using a voice memo app to practice wine pairings, leaving it running in my pocket while I worked. When I played back Tuesday's session the next morning, I heard my own voice reciting inventory. 40 pounds red beans, 18 pounds andouille, 6 cases Sauvignon Blanc. But underneath my mundane litany, something else whispered. The audio quality was poor, muffled by fabric and distance. But when I isolated the frequencies and cranked the volume, the pattern became clear. At timestamp 11:47 p.m., exactly when the vase had moved, a sound like escaping breath formed words. Welcome back. I deleted the file immediately, but the phrase echoed in my skull for days. Welcome back. As if I'd been here before, as if I belonged to this place in some way that transcended employment. The next incident happened near the sealed staircase. Delacroix had mentioned it during my hiring interview, a wooden staircase that once provided discreet access to the upper floors, where the business's more private transactions took place. City ordinances required it to be sealed when the building was converted, but the outline remains visible beneath layers of paint and wallpaper. You can trace the ghost of the banister with your fingers, feel the phantom steps through the drywall. I was carrying prep vegetables from the walk-in cooler when my security badge started chirping. The sound was sharp and insistent, like a smoke detector with a dying battery. The badge hung from a retractable cord on my belt, standard company issue for the alarm system. It had never malfunctioned before. I stopped walking. The chirping intensified, rapid-fire beeps that seemed to sync with my accelerated pulse. The sound was loudest when I stood directly in front of the sealed staircase, where the wallpaper bulges slightly from the underlying framework. On impulse, I pressed my palm against the wall. The chirping became a steady tone, high and urgent. Through the drywall, I felt vibration. Not the building settling, but something rhythmic, purposeful, like someone climbing stairs that no longer existed, their footsteps keeping time with my badge's electronic heartbeat. I jerked my hand back. The chirping stopped. The silence felt expectant, as if the building itself was holding its breath. That night, I researched the history of Madame Evangeline's. The New Orleans Public Library's digital archives paint a picture of elegant debauchery, a place where power brokers came to indulge appetites that couldn't be satisfied in polite society. But between the flowery newspaper descriptions and sanitized historical accounts, darker details emerged. A 1924 police report mentioned complaints from neighboring businesses about unusual sounds emanating from the establishment during daylight hours, when the house should have been quiet. A society page from 1927 referenced mysterious circumstances surrounding the sudden closure of a prominent Royal Street establishment. Most intriguingly, a 1931 building inspection noted structural irregularities in the upper floor access, requiring immediate remediation. No mention of what those irregularities might have been, or why they required the complete sealing of the staircase. I began paying closer attention to the building's rhythms. Every structure has its patterns, the way pipes expand in the morning heat, how floorboards respond to barometric pressure changes, the subtle shifts that occur when traffic vibrates through the foundation. But Delacroix Bistro seemed to operate on a different schedule, one that had nothing to do with temperature or humidity. The sounds were most active between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., the dead hours when the city's pulse slows to its faintest whisper. I started staying later, making excuses about menu planning and inventory management, but really listening to the building breathe. On Thursday night, I positioned myself in the dining room with a digital recorder and a thermos of coffee. The rational part of my mind insisted I was wasting time, chasing phantom sounds that existed only in my sleep-deprived imagination. But the rational part of my mind was losing ground to something deeper, a certainty that had nothing to do with logic. At 2:17 a.m., the temperature dropped, not gradually, like a weather front moving through, but instantaneously. One moment the air was warm and still, heavy with the day's accumulated heat, and the next it was winter cold, my breath forming visible clouds in the dim light. The sounds began immediately after, footsteps in the walls, following the path of the sealed staircase. Slow, measured steps, as if someone was taking great care not to be heard. But these weren't the random creaks of settling wood. They followed the exact pattern of a person climbing stairs. Step, pause, step, pause, each footfall precisely spaced. I counted 23 steps before they stopped. According to the building's original blueprints, which I'd obtained from the city planning office, the sealed staircase contained exactly 23 treads. The digital recorder captured everything. The temperature drop registered as a sharp dip in the ambient sound level, and the footsteps appeared as regular spikes in the low-frequency range. But when I analyzed the audio the next morning, I found something else hidden in the data. Between each footstep, in the pauses where silence should have been, whispered conversations played out in frequencies just below normal hearing range. The words were indistinct, muffled by time and interference, but the cadence was unmistakably human. Two voices, maybe three, engaged in what sounded like negotiation. And underneath it all, threading through the whispers like smoke, a sound I'd heard before, that same hollow laughter, stretched across minutes instead of seconds. My sleep became fractured, broken by dreams of climbing stairs that led nowhere, of rooms that existed between the walls, of laughter that followed me through waking hours. I found myself avoiding the sealed staircase during prep work, taking longer routes through the kitchen to avoid that section of wall where my badge sang its electronic hymn. But avoidance only works for so long in a building where every room holds secrets. Sunday night brought the revelation that shattered my carefully constructed rational explanations. I was cleaning the kitchen after an exhausting dinner service. A party of 12 had ordered the 7-course tasting menu, and we'd been backed up until nearly midnight. The dining room was dark, chairs stacked, the familiar ritual of closing almost complete. I was wiping down the prep station when I heard voices. Not whispers this time, not half-formed sounds hiding in the building's acoustic shadows. Clear, distinct conversation, as if a party of late diners had somehow slipped past my notice. I could make out individual words, the rise and fall of cultured accents, the clink of crystal glasses. My first thought was break-in. Someone had entered through the service entrance, maybe vagrant looking for shelter or thieves casing the silver. I grabbed the largest knife from the magnetic strip and moved toward the dining room, my heart hammering against my ribs. The voices grew clearer as I approached. A man with a tobacco-roughened drawl was discussing cotton futures. A woman with a slight French accent laughed at something I couldn't hear. Someone else mentioned the weather, how unseasonably warm it had been for October. I pressed my ear to the kitchen door. The conversation was coming from the dining room, definitely, but something was wrong with the acoustics. The voices seemed to echo, as if the speakers were in a much larger space than our intimate 40-seat restaurant. I eased the door open and peered through the crack. The dining room was empty. chairs stacked on tables exactly as I'd left them. But the voices continued, clear and present, a ghostly dinner party proceeding in a space that no longer existed. I stepped into the room, knife raised, and the voices stopped. Not gradually, like a conversation naturally ending, but with the abruptness of a radio being switched off. The silence that followed was so complete it felt pressurized, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. And then, from the direction of the sealed staircase, came the sound of applause. Slow, measured clapping, the kind that greets a particularly impressive performance. It started with one pair of hands, then two, then what sounded like a dozen or more, building to a crescendo that made the air itself vibrate. My badge began chirping again, a frantic electronic panic that matched my pulse. But instead of backing away, I found myself walking toward the sound, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name or resist. The applause grew louder with each step, until it felt like standing inside a thunderclap. The wall where the staircase had been sealed began to glow, not with light, but with warmth, a heat shimmer that distorted the air like summer asphalt. I reached out to touch the wall, and the moment my fingertips made contact, everything stopped. No applause, no chirping, no warmth. Just the sudden, absolute silence of a building holding its breath. But in that silence, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice water. My own voice, young and unfamiliar, saying words I'd never spoken. The arrangement is acceptable. When do I start? The voice was mine, but not mine. The same vocal cords, the same accent, but shaped by an experience I'd never had. It was me speaking to someone I couldn't see, agreeing to terms I didn't understand, accepting a position that had been offered decades before I was born. I jerked my hand back from the wall and stumbled away, my vision blurring with panic. The knife clattered to the floor as I fumbled for my keys, my phone, anything that would anchor me to the present moment. But as I reached the front door, I caught sight of my reflection in the antique mirror that hangs beside the coat check. For just a moment, a fraction of a second that stretched into eternity, the face looking back wasn't entirely my own. The features were mine, but older, worn by experiences I'd never had. The eyes held knowledge I'd never acquired. And the expression was one of someone who had been expecting this moment for a very long time. I ran, 3 blocks through the empty quarter before my legs gave out, collapsing onto a wrought iron bench outside St. Louis Cathedral. My phone showed 17 missed calls from the alarm company. Apparently, I'd left the restaurant door open in my flight, triggering the security system. I didn't go back that night, or the next. It's been 4 days now since I've set foot in Delacroix Bistro. 4 days of telling myself that stress and exhaustion and too much solitude had finally caught up with me, that the human mind is capable of extraordinary self-deception when pushed beyond its limits. But the explanation feels thin as tissue paper, ready to tear at the slightest pressure. Because this morning I found a paycheck in my mailbox, not from the restaurant's current owners, but from something called Evangeline Enterprises, LLC. The amount is exactly what I would have earned for 8 months of work, not as a chef in a modern bistro, but as whatever I had agreed to become in that voice that was mine, but not mine. The check is dated 1924. The paper feels authentic. The ink has the right age quality, and when I called the number on the letterhead, a woman's voice answered with a slight French accent and asked if I was planning to return to work soon. She said they'd been holding my position, but patience wasn't infinite, and there were others willing to take my place. I hung up without answering, but I kept the check. Tonight, I'm sitting in my apartment, staring at the old photographs I found in the library archives. Pictures of Madame Evangeline's in its heyday, elegant gentlemen in evening wear ascending a grand staircase to unknown pleasures above. And in one photograph, barely visible in the background near what looks like a service entrance, is a figure in chef's whites. The image is too blurred to make out details, but the height is right, the build is familiar, and there's something about the way he holds his shoulders that makes my breath catch in my throat. The check is still on my kitchen table, waiting for a decision I'm not sure I'm qualified to make. Outside my window, New Orleans pulses with its eternal rhythm, a city built on layers of history so deep they've fossilized into something approaching truth. And somewhere in the quarter, in a building that exists in more than one time, a position remains open, waiting for someone who has already accepted it to finally report for duty. The porcelain sang before it fell. But I'm starting to think that wasn't the beginning of the story. I think it was the end. Story 6. The desert heat never truly left Phoenix, even in the dead of winter. It lingered in the walls, in the concrete, in the very air that seemed to press against the windows of our duplex like something alive and patient. I'd moved in with Blake 3 months earlier, drawn by cheap rent and the promise of a fresh start after the mess I'd left behind in Denver. The place was nothing special, a narrow 2-story wedged between identical units, with beige stucco walls that absorbed the sun's punishment during the day and radiated it back through the night. I should have paid attention to the way Blake's eyes darted toward the kitchen whenever the sun went down. Should have noticed how he'd started drinking his water during dinner instead of making his usual midnight trips to the fridge. But I was too busy settling into my new routine, too focused on the job interviews and the slow process of rebuilding to notice the small changes in his behavior. The first time I saw them, I thought it was my imagination. It was past 11 on a Tuesday, and the house had that particular stillness that comes when the desert finally starts to cool. I'd been working late on my laptop, applying for positions I wasn't particularly excited about, when thirst drove me from the couch toward the kitchen. Our duplex had an open floor plan, and from the living room you could see straight through to the narrow galley kitchen, past the breakfast bar, and into the reflection of the window above the sink. The kitchen was dark except for the green glow of the microwave's clock, casting everything in an aquatic half-light. I moved quietly, not wanting to wake Blake, my bare feet silent on the cold tile. As I reached for the cabinet where we kept the glasses, something in my peripheral vision made me pause. In the window's reflection, not through it, but in the dark glass itself, 2 pinpricks of red light hovered at exactly the height of the microwave. Perfectly still. Perfectly round. Like eyes. My hand froze on the cabinet handle. The logical part of my mind immediately began cataloging explanations. LED lights from some electronic device, the reflection of a smoke detector, maybe the red standby light on the coffee maker. But there was something about their placement, their absolute stillness, that made my scalp prickle with an instinctive wrongness. I turned to look directly at the area where the lights should be, but saw nothing except the familiar bulk of our appliances in the darkness. When I looked back at the window, the red points were still there, unchanged, unblinking. A chill ran up my spine despite the residual heat trapped in the house. I grabbed a glass quickly, filled it from the tap without looking at the reflection again, and retreated to the living room. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me leave. The next night, I found myself hesitating before entering the kitchen. The memory of those red lights had haunted me through the day, surfacing during quiet moments with vivid clarity. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it had been some perfectly mundane reflection distorted by fatigue and an overactive imagination. But when thirst finally drove me from my room, I approached the kitchen like a man walking into a trap. This time I looked directly at the reflection before doing anything else. They were there again. 2 red points of light, motionless and patient, positioned at the exact same height as the night before. But now I noticed something else. The microwave's digital display, which should have shown the time, instead displayed a series of characters that made no sense. My breath caught in my chest. I stared at the bizarre symbols, trying to process what I was seeing. The microwave was new, a sleek black model Blake had bought just before I moved in. I'd never seen it malfunction before, never seen it display anything except the time and cooking duration. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I turned to look directly at the microwave. The display showed the correct time, 11:47 p.m., glowing in familiar green digits. But when I looked back at the reflection, the strange symbols returned. And the red lights had moved closer, not by much, maybe an inch. But they were definitely closer to the glass, as if whatever was creating them had stepped forward while my attention was diverted. I didn't fill a glass that night. I backed out of the kitchen slowly, keeping my eyes on the window's reflection until I was safely in the living room. Then I sat on the couch for 20 minutes, trying to convince myself I was losing my mind. The rational explanations came easily enough. Stress from the move, from unemployment, from the general upheaval of the past few months. Maybe I was having some kind of breakdown, seeing things that weren't there. It wouldn't be the first time stress had manifested in strange ways. But deep down, in the part of my mind that evolution had fine-tuned to recognize predators, I knew I was being watched. Over the next week, the encounters became routine. Every night around the same time, thirst would drive me toward the kitchen, and every night I'd find those red lights waiting in the reflection. Sometimes they'd be in the exact same position. Sometimes they'd be fractionally closer. The microwave display always showed those impossible symbols in the reflection, while displaying the correct time when viewed directly. I started timing my water intake during the day, trying to avoid late-night kitchen visits. But it was impossible to completely eliminate them, and part of me, the part that was either brave or foolish, felt compelled to look, to monitor whatever was monitoring me. Blake seemed oblivious to it all. When I casually mentioned having trouble sleeping, he suggested cutting back on caffeine. When I asked if he'd noticed anything strange about the microwave, he just shrugged and said it worked fine for heating up his leftovers. I didn't press the issue. How could I explain that our kitchen was being watched by something that existed only in reflections? The breakthrough came on a Sunday night, when the lights moved close enough that I could make out more than just red points. They weren't perfectly circular. They had a slight oval shape, elongated like real eyes. And there was something behind them, a darker mass that suggested a face or head, though the details remained frustratingly unclear. That's when I decided to block the window. The plan was simple: eliminate the reflection, eliminate the watchers. Blake was out for the evening, visiting friends across town, so I had the duplex to myself. I gathered newspaper and masking tape, working quickly to cover the kitchen window completely. The paper went up easily, transforming the glass into a blank brown surface that couldn't reflect anything. I felt a surge of relief as I surveyed my work. No more midnight encounters, no more red eyes tracking my movements. Whatever psychological quirk had been causing the hallucinations, removing the trigger should eliminate the symptoms. But that night, when I entered the kitchen for water, I discovered that some problems can't be covered with newspaper. The red lights were back, reflected now in the brushed steel surface of the refrigerator door. They appeared smaller, but somehow more vivid, as if the metal provided a clearer medium for whatever was trying to push through from elsewhere. The sight hit me like a physical blow, confirming that this wasn't simply about one window or one reflection. I approached the refrigerator slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The red lights remained motionless as I drew closer, but I noticed something new. A faint condensation had formed around the door seal, despite the dry desert air. When I reached out tentatively to touch it, the rubber gasket was warm. Not just warm, hot, as if someone had been breathing on it from the inside. The impossibility of it made my head spin. The refrigerator was sealed, filled with food and beverages, not some hidden space where a person could hide. Yet the heat was unmistakable, focused specifically on the area where the seal met the doorframe. I jerked my hand back and stumbled away from the appliance, nearly knocking over a chair in my haste to escape the kitchen. In the living room, I collapsed onto the couch and tried to make sense of what was happening to me. The options were limited and equally disturbing. Either I was experiencing some kind of progressive mental breakdown, complete with vivid hallucinations that were becoming more elaborate with each passing day, or something genuinely impossible was occurring in our duplex. Both possibilities terrified me, but for different reasons. If it was psychological, I needed help. Professional help that would probably require explaining to Blake why I'd started acting so strangely. The thought of admitting to seeing phantom eyes and feeling phantom breath made my stomach churn with embarrassment and dread. If it was real, well, that was even worse. Because if it was real, then something was watching me. something that could manifest in any reflective surface, and had somehow gained enough presence to generate actual heat inside sealed appliances. Sleep came sporadically that night, interrupted by dreams of red eyes and warm breath against my face. I kept waking with the sensation that someone was standing over my bed, but each time I opened my eyes, I found only darkness and the familiar shadows of my room. Blake returned home the next morning in good spirits, chattering about his evening out while he made coffee and toast. I watched him move around the kitchen with casual familiarity, opening the refrigerator without hesitation, using the microwave to reheat leftover pizza. He showed no awareness of anything unusual, no indication that he felt observed or threatened. His normalcy should have been reassuring, but instead it made me feel more isolated. If Blake couldn't see or sense what I was experiencing, then either I truly was losing my mind, or the phenomenon was somehow targeted specifically at me. The newspaper covering the kitchen window caught his attention as he was washing his coffee mug. "What's with the arts and crafts project?" he asked, nodding toward the covered glass. I scrambled for an explanation that wouldn't sound completely insane. The streetlight outside was keeping me awake, too bright. He accepted this without question, which only made me feel worse about lying to him. Blake had been a good friend and roommate, and here I was constructing elaborate deceptions to hide what might be symptoms of a serious mental health crisis. That afternoon, I made an appointment with a local doctor, citing stress and insomnia as my primary concerns. It felt like a reasonable first step, regardless of whether the problem was medical or supernatural. If I was having a breakdown, I needed treatment. If something genuinely inexplicable was happening, I needed to rule out the medical explanation before considering more extreme possibilities. But making the appointment didn't stop the nightly encounters. The red eyes continued to appear in reflective surfaces throughout the kitchen, sometimes in the refrigerator door, sometimes in the chrome surface of the faucet, occasionally in the darkened screen of Blake's tablet when he left it on the counter. They never appeared in the same place twice in a row, as if whatever was behind them had learned to adapt to my attempts to avoid or block specific reflective surfaces. The microwave display kept showing those strange symbols whenever I looked at its reflection, though the actual readout remained normal, and the warm breath phenomenon spread beyond the refrigerator to other appliances. I'd find the dishwasher handle slightly warm, or notice condensation on the chrome trim of the stove that shouldn't have been there in the desert air. Most disturbing of all, the eyes began to move more aggressively when I looked at them. Instead of the subtle inching forward I'd noticed initially, they would shift position noticeably whenever I glanced away and back again. It was like playing a deadly game of red light, green light with something that existed only in mirrors. The doctor's appointment provided no relief. Blood tests came back normal. My blood pressure was slightly elevated, which she attributed to stress, but nothing indicated any serious physical or neurological issues. When I carefully described having trouble with visual disturbances brought on by anxiety, she prescribed a mild anti-anxiety medication and suggested reducing caffeine intake. I filled the prescription but didn't take the pills. Part of me was afraid that if medication made the red eyes disappear, I'd never know if they had been real or imagined. The uncertainty was maddening, but at least it left possibilities open. Blake began to notice my increased agitation. I'd started jumping at sudden noises, avoiding the kitchen except when absolutely necessary, and spending most evenings locked in my room with the door closed. When he asked if everything was okay, I gave vague answers about job stress and adjustment difficulties. "Maybe you should get out more," he suggested one evening as we sat in the living room watching television. "Meet some people, explore the city a bit. You've been cooped up in here for weeks." His concern was genuine, which made my deception feel even worse. But how could I explain that I was afraid to leave the house because something might happen to the duplex while I was gone? That I needed to monitor whatever was monitoring me? The idea sounded insane even in my own head. 3 weeks after the newspaper went up over the kitchen window, I discovered that the watchers weren't confined to the kitchen anymore. I was brushing my teeth before bed when I noticed red pinpricks in the bathroom mirror, positioned just above my left shoulder. They appeared to be looking not at me directly, but at my reflection, watching me watch myself in the glass. The sight made me drop my toothbrush. It clattered into the sink as I spun around, but of course there was nothing behind me except the bathroom wall. When I looked back at the mirror, the red lights had moved to hover above my right shoulder instead. This was worse than the kitchen encounters. The bathroom was my private space, the one room where I'd felt safe from observation, knowing that the eyes could appear there, could watch me during my most vulnerable moments, made my skin crawl with claustrophobic dread. I finished brushing quickly and retreated to my bedroom, but sleep was impossible. Every reflective surface in the room, the darkened computer screen, the glass front of my dresser, even the polished metal of my lamp base, seemed like a potential viewing portal for whatever was tracking my movements. For the first time since the encounters began, I seriously considered leaving, packing my belongings, breaking my agreement with Blake, and finding somewhere else to live. The thought of abandoning him without explanation filled me with guilt, but staying was becoming unbearable. But where would I go? If this was psychological, as the rational part of my mind insisted it must be, then the problem would follow me wherever I moved. And if it was somehow real, what guarantee did I have that it wouldn't pursue me to a new location? The breakthrough came unexpectedly the following weekend. Blake had gone to visit his family in Flagstaff, leaving me alone in the duplex for 2 days. Without his presence to maintain a pretense of normalcy, I found myself obsessing over the red eyes more intensely than ever before. I started mapping their appearances, noting which surfaces they used and when. I experimented with different lighting conditions, trying to determine if they appeared more clearly in darkness or partial illumination. I even tried talking to them, asking direct questions that went unanswered except for subtle movements that might have been coincidental. It was during one of these experimental sessions that I noticed something I'd missed before. The eyes weren't just watching me, they were watching something specific. When I moved around the kitchen, they didn't track my general position. Instead, they remained focused on a particular area near the sink. Curious, I followed their apparent line of sight and found myself staring at the cabinet beneath the kitchen sink. It was an unremarkable space, used for storing cleaning supplies and the small trash can. But as I knelt down to examine it more closely, I noticed that one of the cabinet's back corners had pulled slightly away from the wall. The gap was narrow, maybe half an inch, but it extended down into the space between our duplex and the neighboring unit. And from that dark opening came the faintest suggestion of air movement, as if something on the other side was breathing. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone's flashlight. The narrow beam revealed that the gap extended further than I'd expected, creating a small passage between the walls. The space was too narrow for a person, but wide enough for something else. As I shined the light deeper into the opening, I caught a brief glimpse of something that made my blood freeze. A reflection of my flashlight beam bounced off what looked like polished glass or metal, positioned exactly where a pair of eyes would be if something was lying flat in the space between the walls. I scrambled backward so quickly that I hit my head on the open cabinet door. The impact sent stars across my vision, and by the time I'd recovered enough to look again, whatever I'd seen was gone. But the warm air movement from the gap continued, steady and rhythmic, like breathing. I spent the rest of that night sitting in the living room, staring at the kitchen entrance, and trying to process what I'd discovered. The evidence suggested that someone or something had been living in the space between the duplex walls, watching me through reflective surfaces by positioning itself in various hidden locations throughout the house. The explanation should have been reassuring, a rational physical cause for the strange encounters. But instead it filled me with a new kind of terror. If something was actually living in the walls, hiding in the narrow spaces between units, then I wasn't hallucinating. The red eyes, the warm breath, the strange microwave display, all of it was real. Which meant I was sharing the duplex with something that had been studying me for months, learning my routines, watching me during my most private moments. Blake returned from Flagstaff on Sunday evening, tired but cheerful from his visit with family. I watched him unpack his weekend bag and return to his normal routine, wondering if I should tell him what I'd discovered. But how could I explain that we weren't alone in the house without sounding completely unhinged? Instead, I waited until he'd gone to bed, then returned to the kitchen cabinet with a larger flashlight and a small mirror I'd borrowed from my bathroom. If something was using the space between the walls to observe me, I wanted to get a better look at it. The gap beneath the sink cabinet was exactly as I'd left it, with that subtle air movement that suggested hidden breathing. I positioned myself carefully and used the mirror to reflect the flashlight beam deeper into the opening than I could see directly. What I saw in that angled reflection changed everything. The space between the walls was larger than I'd imagined, opening into what appeared to be a narrow corridor that ran the length of the duplex. And lying along that corridor, parallel to the kitchen wall, was something that looked disturbingly human in its general proportions, but wrong in ways my mind struggled to process. It was too long and too thin, with limbs that bent in ways that suggested too many joints. Its eyes, and they were definitely eyes, not some electronic device, reflected my flashlight beam with that same red glow I'd been seeing for months. But most disturbing of all, its face was turned toward me with an expression of calm awareness, as if it had been waiting for this moment of discovery. We stared at each other through the reflected beam for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then, slowly, deliberately, it smiled. The expression was unmistakably human in its intelligence and intent, but the mouth that produced it was far too wide and filled with far too many teeth. I dropped the mirror and scrambled away from the cabinet, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. Behind me, from the gap beneath the sink, came a sound like soft laughter. That was 6 months ago. I never told Blake what I found. How could I? Instead, I moved out 2 weeks later, claiming that I'd found a better job opportunity in another state. He was disappointed but understanding, and we parted on good terms, with promises to keep in touch. The new apartment I found was on the 3rd floor of a modern building with thick concrete walls and no duplex neighbors to worry about. For the first month, I thought I'd escaped. The red eyes didn't appear in my kitchen window. The microwave displayed normal time readings. The refrigerator stayed properly cool and dry. But last week, I noticed a small gap where the bathroom baseboards meet the wall. Just a tiny opening, barely visible unless you're looking for it. And from that gap comes the faintest suggestion of air movement, warm and rhythmic, like breathing. Last night, I saw red eyes reflected in my computer screen. I'm starting to think that some problems don't get solved by changing locations. They just adapt. The microwave in my new kitchen is starting to display strange symbols when I look at its reflection. I think they've been waiting for me to settle in. Story 7. The impact echoed through my Seattle studio like a body hitting hardwood. Sharp, definitive, wrong. I stood frozen in the doorway, key still warm in my palm, listening to something that shouldn't have been there at all. 3 hours late. The gallery opening had run longer than expected, wine-loosening tongues and wallets alike. My photography, Urban Decay series, all shadows and broken glass, had sold better than anticipated. Success should have felt lighter, but walking up those familiar stairs to my converted loft space, each step had seemed to sink deeper into the building's bones. Before my fingers found the light switch, something moved. Not walked, moved. 4 points of contact with the floor, rapid and purposeful, crossing from the living area toward where I stood. The sound stopped inches from my shoes, and the air itself seemed to thicken at knee height, carrying the smell of old carpet soaked in something I couldn't identify. I held my breath, eyes still closed against the darkness, and reached blindly for the wall switch. Light flooded the space, sudden and harsh, revealing exactly what I expected. Nothing. But the dust along the baseboard told a different story. 4 parallel scratches, deliberate and deep, terminating precisely where the sound had stopped. A handspan from my feet. The rational mind constructs explanations like a spider spins webs, frantically, instinctively, without pause for logic. A raccoon, perhaps. Seattle was full of them, clever enough to work latches, brazen enough to claim territory. The scratches could have been from claws, the 4-point gate perfectly reasonable. The smell, old building, old carpet, moisture seeping through walls that had weathered decades of Pacific Northwest rain. I almost convinced myself. The next morning brought fog so thick it seemed solid, transforming the city into something altogether different. From my 4th floor windows, familiar landmarks vanished. leaving only gray void where the Space Needle should have been. I made coffee and tried to shake the previous night's unease, but the scratches remained, taunting me from across the room. Work provided distraction. The dark room I'd built in the converted bedroom demanded absolute focus, temperature, timing, chemistry, all requiring precise attention. Photography had always been meditation for me, the process of bringing hidden images into light. But that afternoon, developing the shots from the previous week, something was wrong. In frame after frame of abandoned buildings and empty lots, a shadow appeared that hadn't been there when I'd pressed the shutter. Not a flaw in the film or an artifact of development, a deliberate shape, low to the ground, positioned always just at the edge of composition. In some frames, it seemed to be moving toward the camera. In others, away. I checked the negatives. The shadow was there too, embedded in the silver halide crystals like a memory the film had recorded without permission. The logical explanation presented itself immediately. Double exposure, accidental advancing of the film, something I'd overlooked in my haste to capture the perfect shot. But the shadow appeared in every frame of 3 different roles, shot on different days, in different locations, and in each image, it occupied a different position, as if following some pattern I couldn't quite grasp. That evening, I spread the prints across my table, studying them with a loupe until my eyes burned. The shadow was consistent in size and shape, roughly that of a medium-sized dog, but the proportions were wrong. Too long in some dimensions, too compressed in others, as if whatever cast it existed in a space that didn't quite conform to our physics. I was so absorbed in the photographs that I almost missed the sound, a soft scratching from somewhere behind me, rhythmic and patient. When I turned, the room was empty, but the hardwood showed fresh marks beside my chair. 4 parallel lines, shallow but unmistakable. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed listening to the building's night sounds, creaking joints, settling beams, the whisper of wind through gaps I'd never noticed during daylight hours. But beneath the familiar symphony of aging architecture, something else moved, a presence that seemed to hover at the edges of perception, never quite substantial enough to confront directly. The scratches multiplied. I'd find them by the bathroom door in the morning, beside the kitchen sink after making breakfast, trailing from room to room like a map of invisible territory. I began photographing them, documenting their progression with the same obsessive precision I applied to my art. The images revealed patterns within patterns, mathematical relationships, spatial rhythms that suggested intelligence behind the marking. But whose intelligence, and to what end? Dr. Chen, my building's super, was a practical woman who'd managed the converted warehouse for 15 years. When I mentioned the scratches, she nodded thoughtfully and suggested I check the building's history. Old structures carried memories, she said, especially ones that had housed so many different lives over the decades. The public library's microfilm archive yielded fragments, shipping manifests from the building's days as a textile warehouse, business licenses from when it housed a series of failed restaurants, finally the construction permits for the loft conversions in the early 2000s. Nothing suggested any tragedy, no deaths or disasters that might explain my unwelcome visitor, yet the presence grew stronger. I began to feel watched during the day, especially while working in the darkroom. The red safe light would flicker at odd moments, just enough to ruin exposures and force me to start over. Equipment I'd left in specific positions would be moved, never far, just enough to notice. My enlarger's height adjustment would change between sessions. Chemical trays would be rearranged in subtle ways that spoke of intention rather than accident. The smell intensified too. That wet carpet odor now carried undertones of something else. Ozone, perhaps, like the air before a thunderstorm, or metal oxidizing in dampness. It would appear without warning, strongest near floor level, as if whatever produced it remained close to the ground. 3 weeks after that first night, I installed motion-activated cameras in every room. Professional equipment, sensitive enough to detect the slightest movement, linked to a digital recorder that would timestamp every activation. If something was sharing my space, I would capture it. The first night yielded nothing but footage of myself moving through my evening routine, cooking, reading, preparing for bed. But the second night, the living room camera triggered at 3:17 a.m. The timestamp was clear, but the frame showed only empty space, the same furniture arrangements I'd left before sleeping. No movement visible, no disturbance that might have triggered the sensor, except the scratches. Fresh ones, carved deep into the hardwood directly in front of the camera. 4 parallel lines, perfectly positioned in the center of the frame. I watched the footage repeatedly, slowing it down, examining each frame for any hint of movement. The scratches simply appeared, materializing between one moment and the next, as if the wood itself had decided to split along predetermined lines. The camera never wavered, never lost focus, never showed any indication that anything had passed within its field of view. The rational explanations were exhausted: settling house, temperature fluctuations, old wood responding to humidity changes. None accounted for the precision of the markings or their consistent pattern. I was forced to consider possibilities my practical mind rejected. That something existed in my space that cameras couldn't see, that left physical traces of its presence while remaining invisible to both human eyes and electronic sensors, or that my grip on reality was failing. The thought arrived with uncomfortable clarity one morning, as I stood over a fresh set of scratches beside my bed. How long since I'd slept properly? Weeks, certainly. How many meals had I missed while obsessing over photographs and patterns? My hands shook slightly as I raised my camera, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd left the building for anything other than essential errands. Isolation and sleep deprivation could create elaborate hallucinations. I'd read about photographers who'd spent too much time alone in dark rooms, whose minds had conjured entire narratives from the interplay of chemistry and shadow. The scratches could be self-inflicted, carved during episodes I couldn't remember. The smell might be something I'd spilled and forgotten, now filtered through a consciousness increasingly detached from reliable perception. But the photographs didn't lie. The shadow in my Urban Decay series remained consistent across multiple rolls of film, multiple development sessions, multiple chemical baths. Unless I'd somehow contaminated every piece of equipment, manipulated every negative during periods of dissociation I couldn't recall, the evidence was real. I called my ex-wife. We'd divorced 2 years earlier, when my increasing focus on work had finally convinced her that I valued images more than human connection. She'd been wrong about my priorities, but right about my tendency toward obsession. Her voice was cautious when she answered, perhaps wondering why I was calling after months of silence. I explained about the scratches, the photographs, the sense of being watched. I tried to keep my tone level, professional, the way I might describe technical problems with equipment. She listened without interruption, then was quiet for a long moment before responding. Had I been eating regularly? Sleeping? When was the last time I'd had a real conversation with another person? The questions hung between us like accusations. I couldn't remember the last meal I'd finished completely, couldn't recall the last full night's sleep. The gallery opening seemed like something from years ago rather than weeks. My conversations had become limited to brief exchanges with store clerks and delivery drivers. She suggested I stay with friends for a few days, give my mind time to recalibrate away from whatever stress was building in my space. The suggestion was reasonable, caring, and completely impossible. Whatever was happening in my studio was reaching a crescendo. Leaving now would be like abandoning a photograph mid-development, walking away just as the image was beginning to emerge from chemical possibility into visible truth. That night, I set up every camera I owned, positioned them to capture overlapping fields of view throughout the apartment. If something was creating the scratches, moving my equipment, filling my space with presence and odor, I would document it completely. No gaps, no blind spots, no room for doubt about what was or wasn't real. I sat in my dark room with the door open, red light casting everything in the color of emergency. The cameras hummed softly, their mechanical attention focused on empty rooms. Hours passed. My eyes grew heavy despite my determination to remain alert. At some point, exhaustion won. I dozed in my chair, head tilted back against the wall, consciousness drifting between wakefulness and dream. In that liminal space, I became aware of movement, not seen but felt, a disturbance in the air pressure that suggested something large displacing space just beyond the darkroom threshold. I opened my eyes to find the red safe light flickering erratically, casting shifting patterns across the walls. The chemical smell was overwhelming now, mixed with that wet carpet odor until the combination became almost solid, something I could taste as much as breathe. And there, in the doorway, a shadow that the flickering light couldn't quite define. Not moving exactly, but shifting in ways that suggested movement without actually changing position. Familiar from the photographs, but larger now, more substantial, existing in the space between what cameras could capture and what human perception could process. We regarded each other, if each other was the right phrase, for a duration impossible to measure. Time seemed suspended, stretched thin like film exposed to too much light. I understood with perfect clarity that this moment had been building since that first night, that every scratch, every disturbance, every photograph had been leading to this confrontation between presence and perception. The shadow began to move then, not toward me, but around me, circling the dark room's perimeter just beyond the red light's reach. 4 points of contact with the floor, that same rhythm I'd first heard weeks ago, but slower now, more deliberate. With each circuit, it seemed to become slightly more defined, as if the act of observation was somehow solidifying its existence. I reached for my camera, reflexive action, the photographer's instinct to document, but found my hands wouldn't cooperate, not paralyzed, but disconnected, as if the signals from my brain were traveling through medium thicker than air. The shadow completed another circle, and I realized it was leaving marks with each pass, scratches that appeared in its wake like signatures in a guest book written in wood grain. The circling stopped. The shadow positioned itself directly in front of me, close enough that I could feel temperature differential, cold air radiating from something that shouldn't have been able to affect physical space. The smell intensified until it became a presence of its own, dense and cloying, filling my lungs with each breath. Then it spoke, not in words, but in something deeper, understanding transmitted directly from one consciousness to another, bypassing the messy translation of language. What it communicated wasn't threat or warning, but explanation, recognition, a greeting between entities that had been sharing space without acknowledgement. I understood then that my studio had never been mine alone, that the converted warehouse held more than memories of textile workers and failed restaurants, that some presences existed in parallel to our reality, close enough to affect physical objects, but separate enough to remain invisible to instruments designed to capture only what existed fully in our dimensional space. The shadow had been trying to communicate from the beginning. The scratches weren't random markings, but attempts at language, patterns that would have been perfectly clear to something that thought in spatial relationships rather than verbal symbols. The photographs were documentation from its perspective, evidence of our shared existence that I'd misinterpreted as intrusion. We were both occupants of the same space, both trying to make sense of the other's presence, both leaving traces that confused and concerned our counterpart. What I experienced as haunting, it might have experienced as cohabitation with something unpredictably loud and physically disruptive. The red light steadied. The shadow began to fade, but not retreat, simply return to its normal state of existing just beyond normal perception. The chemical smell dissipated, replaced by the familiar odors of developer and fixer, the comfortable perfume of creative work. I remained in my chair until dawn, watching the doorway and waiting for my hands to stop shaking. When morning light finally replaced the darkroom's artificial glow, I found the cameras had recorded nothing unusual. No evidence of the night's encounter beyond fresh scratches arranged in patterns that almost looked like script. Messages written in a language I was only beginning to understand. The photographs from my Urban Decay series remained on the table where I'd left them, but now the shadow in each frame seemed less threatening and more companionable. Another observer documenting the city's quiet transformations, leaving traces of attention in silver and light. I made coffee and stood at my windows, watching Seattle emerge from the morning fog. Somewhere in the building's bones, spaces existed that overlapped with ours in ways architecture couldn't account for. Somewhere in the spectrum of perception, presences moved that cameras couldn't capture, but consciousness could acknowledge. The rational mind still demanded explanations. Sleep deprivation, isolation, the gradual erosion of reliable perception under stress. These remained possible. But they no longer seemed necessary. Reality, I was learning, had room for more possibilities than I'd previously imagined. The scratches continued to appear, but I stopped photographing them as evidence and began reading them as correspondence. My responses were less elegant. Photographs left in specific locations, small adjustments to furniture arrangements, acknowledgments that I was learning to speak a language written in spatial relationships and temporal patterns. Sometimes in the red glow of darkroom work, I would sense observation that felt less like intrusion and more like collaboration. As if whatever shared my space was as fascinated by the alchemy of light and chemistry as I was. Watching images emerge from possibility into permanent form with the appreciation of another craftsman. The building settled around us both, accommodating presences it had learned to contain within walls that held more than their architectural blueprints had ever intended. And I settled too, into an understanding that reality was large enough for both the seen and unseen, the documented and the documented by other means, the rational and the just beyond rational edge of what cameras could capture and minds could accept. The shadow had never been haunting me. We had simply been learning to share the same space, each leaving traces the other could recognize as signs of respectful coexistence. What I had mistaken for supernatural intrusion was actually the most natural thing in the world. Two conscious entities figuring out how to live together without disturbing each other's essential work. Though whether that consciousness belonged to something genuinely other, or to aspects of my own mind I was only beginning to recognize, remained a question I no longer felt compelled to answer definitively. Some mysteries were more valuable as mysteries, existing in the space between explanation and experience, where the most interesting truths often lived. Story 8. The fluorescent lights in Kowalski's 24-hour bakery hummed their familiar tune at 2:17 a.m., casting that sickly yellow pallor over everything they touched. I'd been working the graveyard shift for 3 months now, and the place had settled into my bones like cold Milwaukee winter air, persistent and uncomfortable, but manageable if you learned to ignore it. That's what I told myself anyway. The owner, Mr. K as everyone called him, had warned me about the overnight hours when he hired me. Some people can't handle being alone with the bread and shadows, he'd said with that thick Polish accent, his weathered hands gesturing toward the industrial ovens that dominated the back kitchen. But you look like steady boy. You understand work, yes? I understood work. What I hadn't understood was how the bakery transformed after midnight. How every familiar surface became foreign territory in the half-light. How the constant mechanical breathing of refrigeration units could sound almost watchful. The worst part was the security mirror. Mounted at the corner where the main kitchen connected to the cold storage corridor, the convex surface reflected a distorted fisheye view of anyone moving through that narrow hallway. During day shifts, it was just another piece of equipment, useful for catching a glimpse of co-workers heading to grab ingredients or take inventory. But at night, when you're the only person supposedly in the building, that mirror became an unwelcome companion, always showing you movement in your peripheral vision, always making you question what you'd actually seen. It started small. Quick shadows that could have been steam from the proof boxes, or the way light bent around the industrial mixers. I'd catch something dark moving in that warped reflection and turn to find nothing but empty space and the soft whir of machinery doing its job. Tired eyes, I reasoned. Night shift takes getting used to. But then came the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps echoing from somewhere in the building's deeper recesses. Not the random creaking of old infrastructure settling, but the unmistakable rhythm of someone walking with purpose. The sound would drift from the direction of the cold storage, past the prep areas, toward the far end where we kept the bulk flour stores and the ancient Hobart mixer that predated most of the other equipment by decades. The first time I heard them, I grabbed the industrial flashlight we kept by the time clock and went investigating. My shoes squeaked against the non-slip flooring as I made my way through the kitchen. past the silent ovens and cooling racks, following the corridor toward the source of the sound. Nothing. Empty spaces and the perpetual chill that leaked from the walk-in coolers. I convinced myself it was the building's heating system, the way old pipes expanded and contracted. Milwaukee winters were brutal, and the temperature differential between the heated kitchen and the freezing loading dock area had to put stress on the infrastructure. That explanation worked for about a week. Then I started noticing other things. Small disruptions to the workspace that couldn't be explained by my own movements or the day shift's cleanup routine. The large Hobart mixer in the back storage area would be running when I arrived for my shift, set to its lowest speed, paddle turning lazily through empty air. The first few times I assumed someone from the evening crew had forgotten to switch it off, but when I mentioned it to Rodriguez, the evening supervisor, he insisted his team always shut down all equipment before leaving. Check the maintenance log, he suggested. Maybe Kay had someone in doing repairs. I checked. No maintenance visits, no after-hours work orders, nothing that would explain why a mixer would be running in an empty bakery. The flour trails were harder to dismiss. Wide, heavy impressions in the dusting of flour that inevitably accumulated on the prep room floors throughout the day. Not the narrow sneaker prints left by the day staff or my own work boots, but broader marks, size 12 or 13 at least, that led from the mixer area toward the loading dock and then disappeared. As if whoever had been walking through the flour had simply evaporated. I started taking pictures with my phone, documenting the evidence. The trails always followed the same pattern, starting near the old mixer, moving with measured steps toward the back of the building, then ending abruptly at the heavy steel door that led to the loading dock. When I showed the photos to Mr. K during one of his morning visits, his reaction was strange. He studied the images longer than necessary, his finger tracing the outline of the footprints on my phone screen. "Ah," he said finally, but his voice carried something I hadn't heard before. Not quite fear, but a kind of careful resignation. "You know, this building has much history. Many bakers work here over the years." He disappeared into his office and returned with a framed photograph, black and white, and obviously decades old. The image showed a man in work clothes standing beside what looked like the same Hobart mixer, though the surrounding area appeared different. Older fixtures, different lighting. "This was Teddy," Mr. K said, tapping the glass. "Worked night shift here in '80s. Good baker, very dedicated. Always wore same flannel shirt, always made sure equipment was running proper." I studied the photograph. The man appeared to be in his 40s, thick-bodied and solid-looking, with the kind of hands that suggested years of kneading and lifting. His flannel shirt was a dark plaid pattern, and his work boots looked substantial, exactly the kind that might leave wide impressions in flour dust. What happened to him? Mr. K's expression became guarded. Teddy was very particular about routines. Everything had to be just so, you understand? Bread pans in exact positions, mixing times precise, ingredient storage organized his specific way. When management changed some procedures, he left the sentence hanging, but I could fill in the blanks. Workplace disagreements, personality conflicts. Maybe Teddy had been let go, or had quit in frustration when corporate efficiency initiatives disrupted his methodical approach to the work. "Building holds memories sometimes," Mr. K added, which struck me as an odd thing for a practical businessman to say, especially when someone put much care into the work. I handed back the photograph, but the image stayed with me. Throughout the following nights, I found myself comparing every shadow, every reflected movement in the security mirror, to that figure from the 1980s. The heavy footsteps I heard seemed to match the substantial build of the man in the picture, and the methodical nature of the sounds, always following the same route, always at the same measured pace, fit with Mr. K's description of someone particular about routines. But knowing a possible explanation for the phenomena didn't make them less unsettling. If anything, having a face to attach to the disturbances made them more personal, more intrusive. I began to feel like I was sharing my workspace with an unseen coworker, someone who had his own agenda and his own way of doing things. The sensation of being watched became constant, not the paranoid delusion of someone losing their grip on reality, but the specific localized feeling of eyes tracking your movements from a fixed position. It always seemed to come from the direction of that security mirror, as if someone was standing just outside its field of view, observing my work habits and judging my methods. I developed new routines to cope with the feeling. I'd position myself so I could keep the mirror in my peripheral vision while working, glancing up frequently to catch any movement in its distorted reflection. I started talking to myself, not crazy muttering, but the kind of casual commentary you might make to a coworker about the night's tasks. Batch sizes, oven temperatures. Okay, bread's coming along nicely. Probably another 20 minutes on the sourdough. Timer's set for the morning pastries. Looks like we'll need more butter from the cooler. Equipment check looks good. Everything's running smooth. The weird thing was, it helped. Speaking aloud seemed to establish my presence and authority in the space, pushing back against the feeling of intrusion. For several nights, this strategy worked well enough that I began to think I was adapting to the solitary nature of the job. Then I made the mistake of changing something. It was a small modification, really. The evening crew had loaded the bread pans onto the cooling racks in their usual configuration, 3 levels of standard loaf pans, with the specialty items on the bottom shelf. But the arrangement struck me as inefficient. By swapping the positions, putting the heavier pans on the middle level, and the lighter specialty breads on top, we could improve air circulation and reduce cooling time. It was exactly the kind of optimization that any experienced baker might implement, a minor adjustment to improve workflow and product quality. I spent maybe 10 minutes reorganizing the racks, moving the pans into what seemed like a more logical arrangement. The response was immediate and unmistakable. 3 sharp, deliberate impacts came from inside the walk-in cooler, not the random clunking of equipment or the settling of building materials, but purposeful strikes against the steel door from within. The sound was rhythmic and insistent, like someone knocking to be let out. Bang, bang, bang. Then silence. I stood frozen, listening for any follow-up sounds, but the building had returned to its normal mechanical humming. Part of me wanted to investigate, to pull open that heavy cooler door and verify that the space was empty, except for the usual inventory of dairy products and prepared items. But a larger part of me recognized that opening the door would change something fundamental about my situation. As long as the sounds remained mysterious, I could maintain the fiction that they had mundane explanations. But if I opened that door and found, what? Evidence of an intruder? Or worse, nothing at all, which would mean the sounds had no external source. I left the door closed and tried to continue my work, but the feeling of being watched had intensified dramatically. The security mirror seemed to pulse with reflected movement, always just beyond the edge of clear vision. Every sound in the building, the hum of refrigeration, the whisper of air circulation, the distant rumble of delivery trucks on the street outside, seemed amplified and potentially meaningful. By morning, I had convinced myself that the cooler door incident was coincidental. Old buildings made strange noises, especially when temperature and humidity fluctuated. The fact that it had happened immediately after I rearranged the bread pans was simply unfortunate timing. But when I arrived for my next shift, I found the pans had been returned to their original configuration. Not randomly disturbed, but carefully restored to exactly the arrangement I had found them in 2 nights earlier. The evening crew supervisor confirmed that no one from his team had touched the cooling racks, and Mr. K claimed no knowledge of any after-hours adjustments to the workspace organization. I took photographs of the pan positions before leaving that morning, documenting their exact placement. When I returned the following night, everything remained unchanged, until I decided to test the situation by making the same efficiency adjustment I had attempted before. This time, I worked quickly, but methodically, moving the pans with deliberate care and photographing each step of the process. If someone was entering the building and undoing my work, I wanted evidence of both the original modification and any subsequent changes. I had barely finished positioning the last pan when the sounds began again. Not just 3 knocks from the cooler door, but a complex rhythm of impacts that seemed to come from multiple locations simultaneously. Metallic clanging from the prep area, rhythmic thumping from somewhere near the ovens. And underneath it all, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps moving through the building with increased urgency. The security mirror reflected constant motion now, dark shapes flowing past its curved surface like shadows cast by flames. But when I turned to look directly at the corridor, the space remained empty, lit by the same fluorescent fixtures that had illuminated my work area for months. I grabbed my phone and started recording video, sweeping the camera across the kitchen and down the corridor toward the source of the sounds. On the small screen, everything appeared normal. Empty workspace, idle equipment, the familiar industrial landscape of a commercial bakery between shifts. But the audio track captured something else entirely. Footsteps. Heavy, methodical footsteps moving through the building with the same measured pace I had noticed on previous nights, but now louder and more insistent. And underneath the footsteps, a softer sound that took me several minutes to identify. The whisper of fabric brushing against surfaces, as if someone in loose clothing was moving through narrow spaces. Flannel, I realized. The soft friction of flannel brushing against stainless steel equipment and wooden prep surfaces. The sounds continued for exactly 17 minutes. I timed them on my phone, then stopped as abruptly as they had begun. The building settled back into its normal mechanical ambiance, leaving me standing alone in the kitchen with shaking hands and a phone full of video that would show nothing but empty space to anyone who viewed it later. But I could hear everything, every footstep, every brush of fabric, every deliberate impact of someone moving through the bakery with intimate knowledge of its layout and absolute certainty about their right to be there. When I checked the bread pans the next morning, they had been returned to their original positions. But this time, there was something else. A thin layer of flour dust on the floor around the cooling racks, disturbed in a pattern that matched the wide, heavy footprints I had been finding for weeks. The message was clear. This was someone else's workspace, arranged according to someone else's methods, and my attempts to improve the efficiency were unwelcome intrusions into a system that had been functioning perfectly well without my input. I stopped rearranging the bread pans. I stopped talking aloud to establish my presence. I stopped investigating the sources of strange sounds and started accepting them as part of the building's character. For several nights, this policy of non-interference seemed to work. The footsteps continued, but they felt less aggressive. The security mirror still reflected movement, but the shapes seemed more purposeful and less threatening. I was learning to coexist with whatever shared my workspace during those quiet hours between midnight and dawn. Whether the presence was psychological, my mind creating elaborate explanations for the stress and isolation of night shift work, or something external that defied rational explanation, I had found a way to manage the situation without confronting its ultimate nature. But last night, something changed again. The photograph Mr. K had shown me, the black and white image of the baker from the 1980s, appeared on my prep table sometime during my shift. Not a copy or reproduction, but the same framed original from his office, positioned where I would be sure to notice it when I returned from taking inventory in the cold storage. I had been in the cooler for maybe 15 minutes, counting dairy products and checking expiration dates. The prep area had been empty when I left, with nothing on the stainless steel surface except the usual equipment and ingredient containers. Now the photograph sat dead center on my workspace, the overhead lighting creating a small spotlight effect on the glass surface. The man in the flannel shirt looked exactly as he had when Mr. K first showed me the image, but something about the photograph's placement felt different, more personal, more direct, like an introduction. I picked up the frame and studied the image more carefully than I had before. The quality of the black and white photography revealed details I hadn't noticed during my first viewing. The man's expression, partially shadowed by the industrial lighting of that earlier era, carried a kind of patient intensity that suggested someone deeply invested in the precision of his work. His hands, resting on the edge of the old mixer, were positioned with the unconscious confidence of someone who had performed the same motions thousands of times. But most unsettling was the background of the photograph, the equipment arrangement, the positioning of prep tables and storage racks, even the placement of the security mirror on the far wall. Everything matched the current layout exactly, as if the bakery's configuration had been frozen in time since the 1980s, preserved according to one person's exacting specifications. I set the photograph back on my prep table and tried to continue working, but the feeling of being observed had become overwhelming. Every movement felt scrutinized. Every decision about ingredient proportions or mixing times seemed subject to invisible evaluation by someone who had been perfecting these same processes for decades. The shift ended without any dramatic incidents. No mysterious footsteps. No unexplained equipment operation. No knocking from inside the cooler doors. Just the constant, oppressive sensation of sharing workspace with an unseen presence who was watching, waiting, and judging my every move against some internal standard of proper bakery operation. When I clocked out that morning, I left the photograph on the prep table. Some instinct told me that returning it to Mr. K's office would be seen as rejection, a refusal to acknowledge whatever invitation or recognition was being offered. I drove home through the early morning Milwaukee streets, past the familiar landscape of industrial buildings and working-class neighborhoods, trying to process what had happened. The rational part of my mind insisted that someone, maybe Mr. K himself, maybe a former employee with building access, was playing an elaborate practical joke or conducting some kind of psychological experiment. But rationality couldn't explain the audio recording on my phone, which clearly captured sounds that had no visible source. It couldn't account for the precise restoration of bread pan arrangements or the consistently wide footprints in the flour dust. Most of all, it couldn't dismiss the bone-deep certainty that I was sharing my workplace with someone who had never really left, someone who considered the night shift his permanent domain. I've been thinking about it all day, trying to decide whether to return for another shift tonight. The job pays well, and I need the income. The work itself is satisfying in the way that skilled physical labor can be, and I've grown to appreciate the solitude and independence of working without supervision. But I'm also starting to understand that acceptance of the situation comes with conditions. The bread pans stay in their designated positions. The equipment runs according to established routines. The workspace operates according to methods perfected over years of trial and error by someone who knew exactly how everything should function. I can work the night shift, but only as a temporary occupant of someone else's domain. The building tolerates my presence as long as I respect its existing order and don't presume to improve systems that were working perfectly well before I arrived. The question is whether I can accept being a guest in my own workplace, following protocols established by someone I've never met, but whose influence permeates every aspect of the operation. Whether I can work productively while knowing that every movement is being observed and evaluated by an unseen coworker who has never clocked out, never gone home, never really left the building at all. Tonight, I'll find out. The photograph is waiting for me on the prep table, and I suspect that acknowledging its presence, really seeing it, accepting what it represents, will change the nature of my relationship with whatever shares those quiet hours in Kowalski's bakery. Maybe I'll learn to see the reflection in the security mirror for what it really is. Maybe I'll understand that some routines exist for reasons that transcend efficiency, and that some workplaces hold on to their most dedicated employees in ways that employment contracts never anticipate. Or maybe I'll discover that 3 months of night shift isolation has affected my perception in ways I'm not ready to confront, and that the most unsettling thing about the situation is not what might be sharing my workspace, but what might be happening inside my own mind. Either way, the bread still needs to be baked. The equipment still needs to be monitored. The work still needs to be done, according to methods that have been refined over decades by someone who understood the craft better than I ever will. I just have to decide whether I'm ready to learn from the master, even if the lessons come from someone who should have clocked out for the last time 30 years ago. The night shift starts in 6 hours. The photograph is waiting, and somewhere in the mechanical breathing of that old building, footsteps are already beginning their familiar route through corridors that belong to someone else, someone who never really left, someone who's been waiting patiently for the right apprentice to finally understand the true nature of dedication to the work. Time to see if I'm ready to earn my place in the darkness between the bread and the shadows. Story 9. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar death song as I locked the front door behind the last climber. Another Tuesday night at Vertical Dreams. Another 8 hours of solitude ahead. The climbing gym stretched before me like a cathedral of synthetic stone, its towering walls disappearing into shadows that the overhead lights couldn't quite penetrate. I'd been doing the night shift for 3 months now, ever since the divorce papers came through and I needed the extra cash. The job was simple enough. Clean the mats, wipe down the holds, vacuum the chalk dust, and make sure nobody had left anything behind. The isolation suited me fine. During the day, this place buzzed with chatter and the scraping of rubber on plastic, but at night it belonged to me alone. Or so I thought. I started with my usual routine, working my way across the bouldering area where the crash mats lay scattered like oversized puzzle pieces. The air hung thick with the ghost of chalk dust and rubber, that distinctive climbing gym smell that never quite left your clothes. My footsteps echoed off the high ceiling, creating a rhythm that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. The balance ball pen sat in the far corner, a small fenced area where a dozen large exercise balls waited for the morning's yoga classes. They looked innocent enough in the dim light, rounded shadows clustered together like sleeping sheep. I'd never paid them much attention before. They were just part of the landscape, another piece of equipment to work around. But tonight felt different. The air seemed heavier somehow, pressing down on my shoulders as I dragged the vacuum across the mats. The usual settling sounds of the building, the groan of cooling metal, the whisper of air through vents, seemed amplified, more purposeful. I found myself pausing between tasks, listening for something I couldn't name. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I heard the first sound, a soft rolling, like rubber on concrete. I looked up from the mat I was sanitizing, squinting toward the balance ball pen. One of the balls had somehow made it outside the low fence, sitting perfectly still about 3 feet away from its designated area. The pen's gate was still closed, the magnetic latch secure. I set down my cleaning supplies and walked over to investigate. The ball was nothing special, bright blue, slightly scuffed from use. I picked it up, noting how the material felt oddly warm against my palms, and tossed it back over the fence. It landed with a dull thump among its companions. These things happened. Equipment shifted. Floors weren't perfectly level. The building settled. I'd worked in enough places to know that inanimate objects could seem to have lives of their own. I returned to my cleaning, but the sound of the ball hitting concrete kept echoing in my mind. Something about it hadn't been right. The impact had been too soft, too controlled, like someone had gently placed it down rather than thrown it. 20 minutes later, I was wiping down the holds on the traverse wall when I heard it again. That same rolling sound, followed by silence. This time I didn't look immediately. Instead, I forced myself to finish the section I was working on, my hands steady as I sprayed and wiped each plastic grip. Only then did I turn around. The blue ball sat in the exact same spot as before. My mouth went dry. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the sphere, waiting for it to move again. But it remained perfectly still, casting a round shadow in the pool of light from the nearest fixture. The fence gate was still closed, still latched. I walked over and examined the pen more carefully. The fence was only 3 feet high, easy enough for a ball to roll over if there was enough momentum. But these balls were heavy, and the pen sat on level ground. There was no slope, no obvious force that could propel one over the barrier. I picked up the ball again. This time it felt cold, almost clammy, and I noticed something I'd missed before. The surface was covered in a fine layer of chalk dust, the white powder that climbers use to improve their grip. That wasn't unusual in itself. Everything in the gym accumulated chalk over time. But this dust wasn't uniform. It was concentrated in 5 distinct spots, each about the size of a fingertip. My hands trembled slightly as I examined the marks more closely. They were too deliberate to be random, too purposeful to be accidental. Someone had grabbed this ball with chalky fingers, leaving behind perfect prints of their grip. But I was alone in the building. I had been for hours. I forced myself to think rationally. One of the evening climbers must have handled the ball before leaving. The marks could have been there all along, and I simply hadn't noticed them in the dim light. People touched things. It was normal, explainable. I tossed the ball back into the pen with more force this time, watching it bounce off the far wall and settle among the others. Then I turned the overhead light to full brightness and continued my work. determined to finish my shift without any more distractions. The next hour passed without incident. I cleaned the training area, emptied the trash, and restocked the bathroom supplies. The familiar routine helped calm my nerves, and I began to feel foolish for letting my imagination run wild. Night shifts could play tricks on your mind. Everyone knew that. But as I crossed the main floor toward the equipment closet, I heard something that made my blood freeze. A slow, deliberate squeaking, rubber dragging across concrete with the distinctive chirp of material seeking traction. It sounded exactly like fingers trying to find purchase on a smooth surface. I stopped walking and listened. The sound came again. 3 short squeaks followed by silence. Then again. It was coming from the direction of the balance ball pen. Every instinct told me to leave, to finish up quickly and get out. But something stronger, curiosity, or maybe just the need to prove to myself that nothing supernatural was happening, pulled me toward the corner. The pen looked empty. I blinked hard, certain my eyes were playing tricks. But no matter how I angled my head or adjusted my position, I counted only 11 balls where there should have been 12. The blue one was missing. A soft thud behind me made me spin around. There it sat, 5 feet away, perfectly centered under a pool of light. But this time I could see it move. Just barely, just enough to catch in my peripheral vision. A slight rocking motion, as if it had recently stopped rolling. As if invisible hands were still steadying it. The chalk marks were more pronounced now. Not just 5 fingerprints, but what looked like the impression of an entire palm. And spreading outward from the main grip were smaller marks. Thumbprints, the tips of fingers searching for better hold. I approached slowly, my sneakers silent on the rubber flooring. The ball remained motionless, but I could swear I felt something watching me. The sensation was so strong it raised goosebumps along my arms and made the back of my neck tingle. I reached out to touch the ball, then jerked my hand back. The air around it felt different. Cooler, denser, charged with some kind of invisible energy. And underneath the familiar gym smells of chalk and rubber, I detected something else. Something organic and unpleasant, like the scent of old sweat, but deeper, more primal. That's when I noticed the chalk dust on the floor. It wasn't scattered randomly like you'd expect from normal gym use. Instead, it formed patterns around the ball, swirls and whirls that looked disturbingly like fingerprints magnified to enormous size. And leading away from the ball, barely visible against the dark flooring, were what appeared to be handprints. Palm prints, actually, as if someone had been crawling on their hands and knees, or as if something had been dragging itself across the floor. I followed the trail with my eyes, my heart hammering against my ribs. The prints led toward the base of the climbing wall, where they seemed to climb upward into the shadows. But that was impossible. No one could scale a wall using only their palms, leaving perfect chalk impressions on smooth concrete. A soft sound from above made me look up. The gym's ribbon banners, colorful strips of fabric that normally hung motionless from the ceiling, were moving. Not swaying like they would in a breeze, but rippling in deliberate waves, as if something was brushing against them as it moved through the upper reaches of the building. I grabbed a powerful flashlight from my cleaning cart and aimed it upward. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the network of support beams and ventilation ducts that formed the gym's skeleton. At first I saw nothing unusual. Then, just at the edge of the light's reach, I caught a glimpse of movement. Something was up there. It wasn't human. I was sure of that. The proportions were wrong. The way it moved too fluid, too deliberate. It seemed to flow rather than crawl, pressing itself against the ceiling with what looked like multiple points of contact. And wherever it touched, small puffs of chalk dust drifted down like snow. I kept the light trained on the area, but whatever I'd seen had vanished into the deeper shadows. Only the falling dust remained, creating tiny clouds that caught the beam like particles in a sunlit window. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. A cat that had somehow gotten into the building. A bird. Some kind of maintenance equipment I wasn't aware of. But deep down, I knew none of those theories fit what I'd witnessed. A new sound made me lower the flashlight. The familiar squeak of rubber on concrete. The blue ball was moving again, but this time I could see exactly how it was happening. Invisible fingers were gripping its surface, fingers that left perfect chalk impressions as they adjusted their hold. The ball rocked back and forth as if whatever was gripping it was testing its weight, learning its resistance. Then, with deliberate care, it began to roll. Not randomly, not following any natural path dictated by gravity or momentum. It rolled in a perfect straight line directly toward me, stopping just inches from my feet. The chalk marks on its surface had multiplied, overlapping prints that suggested multiple hands had been exploring its surface. I stumbled backward, my cleaning cart clattering as I bumped into it. The sound echoed through the gym, followed by an answering noise from above, a scraping, scuttling sound like claws on metal. The ribbon banners began to ripple more violently, as if something large was moving through them. That's when I realized the truth. Whatever was in the gym with me wasn't just touching the ball. It was playing with it, testing it, learning from it, learning about texture and grip and resistance, learning about what it felt like to hold things. I backed toward the exit, my eyes fixed on the ceiling where the banners continued their impossible dance. The chalk dust was falling more heavily now, creating visible streams in the air like snow in a storm. And in that falling dust, I began to see shapes, not clear enough to be certain, but suggesting forms that shouldn't exist. Elongated fingers that stretched too far, joints that bent in wrong directions. Something that had learned to grip and grasp, but hadn't quite mastered the anatomy of human hands. The blue ball began to roll again, this time in lazy circles around my feet, like a cat marking its territory. Each revolution left new chalk marks on the floor, and I realized with growing horror that the patterns were getting more complex, more deliberate. Whatever was creating them was learning, adapting, getting better at manipulation with each attempt. I broke for the exit, abandoning my cart and supplies in my desperate rush to reach the door. Behind me, I heard a sound that would haunt my dreams. The squeak and roll of not just one ball, but several, as if my sudden movement had triggered a feeding response. I fumbled with the locks, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the keys. In the reflection of the glass door, I caught a glimpse of the gym behind me. The balance balls had somehow escaped their pen and were scattered across the floor, each one marked with those telltale chalk impressions. And above them, moving through the ceiling space like some impossible spider, a shadow that seemed to have too many limbs and moved with the wrong kind of grace. The door finally opened, and I stumbled out into the crisp Denver night. The streetlights had never looked more welcoming, the distant traffic sounds more reassuring. I stood there for several minutes, breathing hard, trying to convince myself that what I'd experienced was some kind of breakdown brought on by stress and isolation. But when I looked back through the glass doors, I could see the chalk dust still falling like ash through the gym's interior lights. And silhouetted against that pale precipitation, the shape of something impossible perched among the ceiling beams, watching me with what I somehow knew were hungry, intelligent eyes. I never returned to finish that shift, or any shift. 3 months later, I heard that Vertical Dreams had closed unexpectedly. The official story was structural problems, something about stress fractures in the ceiling supports that made the building unsafe. But I spoke to one of the day staff who mentioned something strange about the weeks before closure. Climbers had been complaining about equipment malfunction, balance balls that seemed to move on their own, chalk that appeared in impossible places, the sensation of being watched while training alone. Most disturbing of all, several members reported that their grip strength had improved dramatically after using the gym's balance balls. Not gradually, as you'd expect from normal training, but overnight. As if something had been teaching their hands how to hold on tighter, how to never let go. I still wake up sometimes with the memory of that squeaking sound, rubber seeking traction against smooth surfaces. And in those half-awake moments, I swear I can feel invisible fingers exploring my own hands, learning the shape of my grip, the texture of my skin, testing my resistance, measuring how tightly I can hold on when something decides it's time to pull me toward the ceiling. Story 10. I should have known something was wrong the moment I felt those fingers wrap around my ankles. The afternoon sun had been cutting through the industrial windows of my Portland loft, casting those familiar geometric shadows across the hardwood floor. I dozed off on the sectional sofa, laptop still warm on my chest, the steady hum of downtown traffic below lulling me into that strange half-sleep where dreams and consciousness blur together like watercolors in rain. Then came the pull. Not violent, not urgent, just a steady, deliberate pressure around my ankles, dragging me slowly toward the foot of the couch. My body moved maybe 6 inches, just enough to align my legs with the edge of the glass coffee table. The sensation was unmistakably human. The grip of palms and fingers, the slight warmth of skin through my socks. But when I jerked awake, heart hammering against my ribs, there was nothing there. Nothing except the ceiling. Above me, the white-painted surface had transformed into something else entirely. Where moments before there had been the familiar texture of old plaster and the slight water stain near the exposed beam, now there was only darkness. Not shadow, not the absence of light, but a darkness so complete it seemed to have weight, substance. It pressed down on me like a held breath, like the moment before thunder breaks. The edges where this void met the normal ceiling were sharp as knife cuts. No gradual fade, no trick of lighting. Just an abrupt transition from familiar white plaster to something that seemed to exist in negative space, a hole punched through reality itself. I lay frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. The darkness didn't shift or ripple. It simply was, hovering maybe 8 feet above me, the exact dimensions of the sofa where I lay. Through it, I could sense presence, not see it, not hear it, but feel it the way you feel someone standing behind you in an empty room. Minutes crawled by. My neck ached from craning upward. My eyes watered from staring into that void, searching for any detail, any explanation. The air in the room felt different, thicker, as if something massive had displaced the normal atmosphere. The familiar sounds of my loft, the whisper of the HVAC system, the settling of old wood, the distant hum of the refrigerator, seemed muffled, dampened by whatever presence filled that space above me. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the weight lifted. The transition was instant. One moment I was trapped beneath that oppressive void, the next I was staring at ordinary ceiling plaster, afternoon light streaming normally through the windows. The air rushed back into the room like water filling a vacuum, and I could breathe fully again. But something had changed. The digital clock on my kitchen counter, visible from where I lay, read 3:47 p.m. I knew with absolute certainty it had been 3:52 when I'd first felt those hands on my ankles. 5 minutes had vanished, or been taken, or folded in on themselves somehow. And when I finally worked up the courage to check my phone, my laptop, the analog clock on the bookshelf, they all confirmed the kitchen's new reality. 3:47 p.m., exactly 5 minutes behind where time should have been. That was 3 months ago, and those 5 minutes have never come back. At first, I told myself it was a simple malfunction. Old building, electrical issues, maybe a power surge that reset everything at once. But the analog clock on my bookshelf doesn't run on electricity. It's a wind-up my grandfather left me, the kind with actual gears and springs. And my phone connects to cell towers, syncs with satellites. There's no reasonable explanation for how every timepiece in my apartment could lose the same 5 minutes simultaneously. Except for the presence in the ceiling. I began to notice other things in the days that followed. Small displacements, subtle wrongnesses that I might have dismissed if not for that initial, impossible experience. Items moved slightly from where I'd left them. Never far, never dramatically, just enough to catch my peripheral vision and make me question my memory. My coffee mug shifted 2 inches to the left on the kitchen counter. A book I'd been reading appeared on a different shelf. My shoes, always kicked off haphazardly by the door, would be found neatly aligned the next morning. And always, I felt watched. The sensation followed me through my daily routines like a shadow with weight. While brushing my teeth, I'd catch myself glancing up at the bathroom mirror, certain I'd see something behind me. In the shower, hot water streaming down my back, I'd feel that familiar pressure above and find myself staring up at the ceiling tiles, waiting for one to darken, to become that void again. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed, covers pulled up to my chin, listening to the building's night sounds and trying to convince myself that the subtle creaking above was just old wood settling, not footsteps. But the rhythm was too deliberate, too purposeful, back and forth across the floor of the apartment above mine, except there was no apartment above mine. The building's blueprints, which I'd obsessively studied online, showed clearly that my unit was directly below the roof. Yet the footsteps continued, night after night. I started sleeping on the couch again, drawn back to the site of that first encounter despite every instinct screaming against it. The logical part of my mind insisted I was avoiding my bedroom to escape the sound of phantom footsteps, but deep down, I knew the truth. I was hoping it would happen again. Whatever had visited me that afternoon, whatever had stolen those 5 minutes, I needed to understand it. The second encounter came on a Thursday evening in November. I'd fallen asleep reading, books splayed across my chest, when the familiar sensation of being touched jerked me back to consciousness. This time it wasn't my ankles. Fingers traced slowly up my arm, from wrist to elbow, with the methodical precision of someone taking measurements. The touch was cool, slightly damp, and left no visible mark on my skin. Above me, the ceiling had transformed again. But this time the void was different, larger, extending beyond the boundaries of the sofa to encompass nearly half the living room. And within that darkness, I could see movement. Not shapes exactly, but disturbances in the black, like ripples across the surface of a deep pond. The air grew thick again, pressing against my eardrums until they popped. Sound became distorted. My own breathing seemed to echo from impossible distances, and when I tried to whisper a prayer I hadn't spoken since childhood, my voice emerged flat and hollow, as if the words were being absorbed before they could properly form. Through the darkness above, I heard something that might have been communication. Not words in any language I recognized, but a rhythmic pattern of tones that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly in my bones. The sound was questioning, probing, as if whatever presence inhabited that void was trying to understand me as desperately as I was trying to understand it. This time, when the weight lifted and the ceiling returned to normal, only 3 minutes had been lost. I began keeping detailed records after that. Every incident cataloged with obsessive precision. Time of day, duration, physical sensations, environmental changes. The pattern that emerged was both reassuring and terrifying. The encounters were becoming more frequent but shorter, as if whatever was visiting me was learning, adapting, becoming more efficient in its observations, or feeding. The thought came unbidden one night as I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by notebooks filled with my increasingly frantic documentation. What if those missing minutes weren't lost but consumed? What if something was slowly, methodically, taking pieces of my time, my life, my reality, one small bite at a time? I tried to leave, packed a bag, made reservations at a hotel across town, convinced myself that distance would break whatever connection had formed between me and the thing in my ceiling. But as I reached for the door handle, my kitchen clock chimed 3:47, the impossible time it had been showing for months. And I realized that the 5 minutes it had stolen weren't just missing from my clocks. They were missing from me, somewhere in the back of my mind, in the place where memories live and thoughts form. There was a gap. 5 minutes of experience that I could never access, never remember, never reclaim. And with each subsequent encounter, each stolen moment of time, that gap grew wider. I put my suitcase away and returned to the couch. The thing above me isn't malevolent, I've come to understand. It's curious, perhaps even benevolent in its alien way. Like a child pulling apart a clock to see how it works. It's carefully dismantling pieces of my existence to comprehend what I am, how I function, what makes me human. Last night, it took 7 minutes. I felt its presence descend like a weight-heavy blanket, watched the ceiling dissolve into that familiar void, and let those cool, measuring fingers trace patterns across my skin that I'll never be able to remember. The sensation was almost comforting now, like being examined by a doctor whose instruments can probe not just flesh and bone, but time itself. When I woke this morning, my clocks had reset themselves again. Not backward this time, forward. 12:47. AM had become 12:54 AM in an instant, and I understood with crystalline clarity that whatever had been observing me had finally learned enough to begin the next phase of its study. It's not stealing my time anymore. It's learning to give it back. And that terrifies me more than anything that came before, because now I have to wonder, when it's finished with its observations, when it fully understands how human time works, what happens to the original? What happens to me? The question haunts me as I sit here in the gray light of dawn, staring up at the ceiling that might at any moment dissolve into darkness. My coffee grows cold on the table beside me, and I realize I can't remember making it. Can't remember the taste, the warmth in my hands, the simple human pleasure of that first morning sip. Another piece gone, another measurement taken. I am becoming a blueprint, a schematic for something else to study, and eventually, perhaps, replace. And the most terrifying part of it all is that I'm beginning to understand why the presence above me is so fascinated by human time. Time is memory. Time is consciousness. Time is the thread that weaves individual moments into the coherent story we call a life. And something is very carefully learning how to weave that thread for itself. Story 11. The old Victorian house on Friendship Avenue had that particular Pittsburgh smell. Industrial dust mixed with decades of cigarettes and something else. Something organic that seemed to seep from the basement walls. My buddy Trevor had inherited it from his grandmother 6 months earlier, and we'd been using the dining room as our miniature painting station every Thursday night since March. The setup was perfect. Large oak table, good lighting from the chandelier above, and enough space to spread out our Warhammer armies without knocking over paint pots. Trevor worked nights at the steel mill, so I usually had the place to myself until he got home around 11. That's when we'd crack open beers and compare our progress. His Space Marines against my Chaos Forces, both of us chasing that elusive, perfect paint job that would make the figures look like they'd stepped straight out of the game's artwork. It was a Thursday in late October when we decided to document our process. Trevor had suggested recording our painting sessions to review our techniques later, maybe even start a YouTube channel. The idea seemed harmless enough. We positioned his old Canon camcorder on a stack of books, angled to capture the entire table and part of the room beyond. The plan was simple: start recording before heading out for our usual snack run to the corner store, then review the footage later to see how our miniatures looked under the dining room's warm light. We'd been debating whether the overhead chandelier cast too many shadows, and the video would settle it once and for all. I remember adjusting the airbrush one last time before we left, making sure it was properly depressurized. The compressor had been acting up lately, building pressure even when switched off, and I didn't want any accidents while we were gone. The brush sat on its stand, nozzle pointed toward a sheet of test paper I'd laid out earlier. The walk to the store took maybe 15 minutes round trip. We grabbed our usual: beef jerky, energy drinks, a bag of pretzels, chatting about Trevor's latest batch of miniatures, and my struggles with getting clean-edge highlights on my Chaos Lord's armor. Normal conversation, the kind that filled countless Thursday evenings. When we returned, nothing looked disturbed. The miniatures stood exactly where we'd left them, paintbrushes still balanced across palette edges, the airbrush in its stand. But when we sat down to resume painting, something felt different. The air seemed heavier somehow, carrying that basement smell more strongly than before. It wasn't until 2 days later that we watched the footage. The first 47 minutes showed exactly what you'd expect: an empty dining room, miniatures casting small shadows under the chandelier, dust motes drifting through beams of light from the windows. Then, at exactly 8:23 p.m. according to the timestamp, came the sound of the front door's deadbolt clicking into place. We both heard it clearly through the camera's microphone, that distinctive metallic snap of the old lock engaging. But what made my skin prickle was what came immediately after. A voice, low and masculine, speaking just 2 words with perfect clarity. "Be quick." The voice seemed to come from somewhere behind the camera, as if someone had been standing in the living room doorway. But that was impossible. We'd been alone in the house, and we'd locked the door ourselves when leaving. Trevor rewound the section 3 times. Each viewing confirmed what we'd heard, though the voice's location remained maddeningly unclear. The camera's built-in microphone wasn't sophisticated enough to provide directional audio cues, but the words were undeniable. Then came the second anomaly. Roughly 30 seconds after the voice, the airbrush, the one I'd carefully depressurized, released a sharp puff of air. The burst lasted maybe 2 seconds, just long enough to create a perfect arc across the test paper. The pattern was too precise to be random, too deliberate to be mechanical failure. It pointed directly toward the basement door, visible at the edge of the camera's frame. We stared at the screen in silence. The airbrush's compressor remained off throughout the entire recording, its power light dark. No pressure buildup, no electrical interference. Nothing that could explain the burst of air that created that unnaturally straight line. Trevor suggested we were overthinking things. Old houses made weird noises, he said. Maybe the voice was audio bleeding from a neighbor's television, or someone walking past on the sidewalk. The airbrush incident was probably just residual pressure in the line, released by some vibration or temperature change. His explanations sounded reasonable in daylight, but they felt thin when we returned the following Thursday. The basement smell seemed stronger, and I found myself glancing toward that door more often than usual. Every creak of the old house's settling bones made me look up from my miniatures, paintbrush frozen mid-stroke. We decided to run another test. This time we'd leave a digital recorder running while we made our snack run, something more sensitive than the camcorder's microphone. Trevor borrowed a device from his buddy who worked in audio production, a professional unit capable of picking up sounds the human ear might miss. The setup was identical. Camera recording the table, recorder placed on the mantelpiece to capture the room's audio, airbrush depressurized and positioned on its stand. We locked the front door and headed to the store, taking the same route, buying the same items, maintaining the same timeline. When we returned, the familiar weight in the air seemed more oppressive. The basement door, which I'd sworn was slightly ajar when we left, now appeared firmly closed. But doors in old houses shifted with temperature changes, I told myself. Wood expanded and contracted, simple physics. The camera footage showed nothing unusual this time. No mysterious voices, no airbrush activity. Just an empty dining room for 51 minutes. But the audio recorder told a different story. At 8:19 p.m., 4 minutes before the previous week's voice, we heard footsteps. Not the heavy boots of someone walking normally, but the careful, deliberate steps of someone trying to move quietly. The sounds came in a clear pattern. Measured footfalls descending what could only be the basement stairs, each step distinct against the wooden boards we knew were down there. The footsteps descended halfway, then stopped. For the next 32 minutes of recording, nothing. Complete silence from that direction, as if whoever or whatever had been going downstairs had simply paused on the landing, waiting. The audio was crystal clear. We could hear cars passing outside, the refrigerator cycling on and off in the kitchen, even the subtle sounds of the house settling around us. But from the basement, after those initial steps, came absolute stillness. Not the silence of an empty space, but the quiet of someone holding their breath. Trevor's explanations grew less confident. Maybe mice in the walls, he suggested, though we both knew mice didn't create such regular measured sounds. Maybe expansion and contraction of the house's framework, though that wouldn't explain the pattern or the abrupt cessation. I started researching the house's history. The previous owner, Trevor's grandmother, had lived there alone for nearly 30 years after her husband died. Neighbors described her as reclusive in her final years, rarely leaving the house. Groceries delivered weekly by a local service. The basement, according to the realtor's notes, contained the original coal furnace and storage areas, plus what appeared to be a workshop of some kind. Trevor admitted he'd never fully explored the basement. His grandmother had kept it locked during his childhood visits, claiming it wasn't safe for children. After inheriting the house, he'd done a quick inspection with a flashlight, enough to confirm there were no major structural issues or water damage, but he'd never spent time down there. The workshop, he remembered, contained an old workbench and various tools, including what looked like woodworking equipment. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars and containers he hadn't examined closely. The whole space felt frozen in time, as if someone had simply stopped working one day and walked away. Thursday came again, and I found myself dreading the evening for the first time since we'd started our painting sessions. The house felt different now, charged with an anticipation that made my skin crawl. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound more significant. We set up the recording equipment again, camera and audio recorder both, but this time I suggested we stay in the house during our usual departure time. Maybe we could catch whatever was causing these disturbances, observe it directly instead of relying on recordings. Trevor agreed, though I could see the reluctance in his eyes. We positioned ourselves in the living room with a clear view of both the dining room and the basement door. Lights dimmed to match the usual conditions when we'd leave for the store. 8:20 p.m. came and went. No footsteps, no voices, nothing unusual. We waited until nearly 9 o'clock before giving up, concluding that our presence had somehow prevented whatever typically occurred during our absence. But when we checked the recordings later, we discovered something that made my blood turn cold. The audio had captured our conversation in the living room, clear as day. But underneath our voices, barely audible, came the sound of breathing. Not our breathing. We were talking, moving around, making the normal sounds of two people waiting and watching. This was something else entirely. Slow, measured breaths that seemed to echo from an empty space. The breathing continued for exactly as long as we'd remained in the living room. When we finally moved back to the dining room and turned up the lights, it stopped. Trevor's face had gone pale as we listened to the recording. The basement door remained in the camera's peripheral view throughout the evening, never opening, never showing any sign of movement. Yet something had been breathing down there in the darkness, patient and still, aware of our presence above. That night, I suggested we explore the basement together. Trevor resisted at first, claiming it was just old house settling, pipes expanding, any number of rational explanations. But I could see the doubt in his eyes, the same creeping uncertainty that had been growing in my own mind. We descended the narrow wooden stairs with flashlights, the beams cutting through air thick with dust and that organic smell I'd noticed upstairs. The basement was larger than expected, stretching under most of the house's first floor. The workshop area occupied the far corner, exactly as Trevor had described: workbench, tools, shelves lined with glass jars containing unidentifiable substances. But it was the chair that caught my attention. Positioned directly below the dining room, an old wooden chair sat facing the stairs. Not tucked away in storage, not covered with dust like everything else, but clean and deliberately placed. The seat showed signs of recent use: compressed cushioning, armrests worn smooth by repeated contact with human hands. Trevor swore he'd never seen the chair before. During his quick inspection months earlier, he remembered only storage boxes and workshop equipment. Nothing about a chair positioned like someone had been sitting there regularly, looking up toward the first floor. The ceiling directly above the chair showed scuff marks in the wood, as if something had been tapping against it repeatedly. I realized with growing horror that those marks aligned perfectly with our painting table upstairs. Someone, or something, had been sitting below us every Thursday night, listening to our conversations, our laughter, the quiet sounds of brush against miniature. We climbed back upstairs in silence, both of us processing what we'd discovered. The breathing on the audio recording suddenly made perfect sense. Whatever presence inhabited that basement had been aware of us from the beginning, monitoring our routines, learning our patterns. The voice saying, "Be quick," wasn't a warning or threat. It was instruction, as if our mysterious observer had grown impatient with waiting for us to leave so it could continue its own activities undisturbed. Over the following weeks, I found myself canceling our Thursday sessions with increasing frequency. The house's atmosphere had become unbearable, that organic smell now seemingly permanent throughout the first floor. Trevor didn't argue when I suggested we take a break from painting, maybe find a different location for our hobby. But the dream started anyway. Every night, I found myself standing in that basement, staring at the wooden chair while invisible footsteps descended the stairs behind me. In these dreams, I never turned around to see who was approaching. I would wake before the footsteps reached the bottom, heart pounding, sheets soaked with sweat that carried that same organic smell from the house. The dreams felt more real than the waking hours. During the day, I could almost convince myself that everything had rational explanations, but at night, in that liminal space between sleep and consciousness, I knew with absolute certainty that something had been sharing that basement with us, patient and watching, waiting for us to acknowledge its presence. Trevor started avoiding my calls. When I finally reached him, his voice sounded strained, distant. He'd been having his own experiences, he admitted. Sounds from the basement at all hours, not just Thursday evenings. The smell had grown stronger, sometimes overwhelming. He'd started sleeping at his girlfriend's apartment most nights, only returning to the house when absolutely necessary. The basement door had started opening by itself, he said. Not dramatically, just a few inches, as if someone was testing the hinges or checking to see if anyone was watching. He'd installed a new lock, but the door continued to drift open despite the mechanism. I suggested he move out, find a new place, leave whatever was in that house undisturbed, but Trevor reminded me that he couldn't afford to abandon the property. His grandmother had left it to him free and clear, the only asset he'd ever owned. Whatever was sharing the space with him, he'd have to learn to coexist. The last time I visited was in December, nearly 2 months after our final painting session. Trevor had called, claiming he'd figured out what was happening, that he had answers that would put everything into perspective. The house felt different immediately upon entering. The organic smell had intensified to an almost overwhelming degree, but there was something else now, the distinct odor of fresh wood shavings, as if someone had been working with tools recently. Trevor led me to the basement without explanation. The workshop area had been transformed. What had previously looked like abandoned equipment now showed clear signs of recent use. Wood shavings covered the floor around the workbench, and several pieces of carved wood sat on the table's surface. The wooden chair remained in its position below the dining room, but now it had been joined by a second chair, newly carved, perfectly matching the first in style and construction. Both chairs faced the stairs, as if positioned for an audience of two. Trevor's eyes held a glassy quality that made me uncomfortable. He explained that he'd been having conversations with his grandmother, long discussions about the house's history and the work that needed to be completed in the basement. She'd always been skilled with woodworking, he said, and death hadn't stopped her from continuing her projects. The breathing sounds we'd recorded, the footsteps, the patient waiting, all of it made perfect sense now. His grandmother had simply been trying to finish what she'd started, working in her familiar space during the quiet hours when she wouldn't be disturbed. The chair had always been there. Trevor had just forgotten about it during his brief initial inspection. As he spoke, I heard the soft sound of wood being carved somewhere in the shadows beyond our flashlight beams. Regular, measured scraping that matched the rhythm of someone working with hand tools. Trevor didn't seem to notice, continuing his explanation about how peaceful the house had become once he'd stopped fighting the presence and started accepting it as natural. I left without saying goodbye, driving straight home through the early winter darkness. Behind me, the house's windows glowed with warm light, and I could swear I saw 2 figures moving around the dining room, resuming work on projects that death had only temporarily interrupted. The rational part of my mind insists that Trevor suffered some kind of breakdown, that isolation and stress had pushed him into a delusional state where he'd begun attributing his own actions to his deceased grandmother. The new chair was something he'd carved himself during fugue states, the workshop's recent use evidence of his own nighttime activities he couldn't remember. But I still wake up sometimes to the sound of wood being carved in my own basement, though I live in a modern house with concrete floors and no workshop equipment. The organic smell drifts through my dreams, accompanied by patient breathing and the soft scrape of tools against wood. And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I find myself wondering if Trevor had been right all along. Maybe death doesn't stop the work we leave unfinished. Maybe some projects are too important to abandon, requiring completion regardless of the physical limitations that separate the living from the dead. The miniatures we'd painted together remain in my closet, boxed away and untouched since that final Thursday. But occasionally I hear them shifting in their containers, small movements like figures adjusting position or turning to look toward sounds only they can detect. I tell myself it's just temperature changes affecting the plastic, expansion and contraction that creates the illusion of movement. I don't check to see if they've actually moved. Some questions are better left unanswered, some mysteries better preserved in the space between knowing and not knowing, where terror and wonder intersect in the darkness of our imagination. Story 12. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as I locked the front entrance of Crawford's department store, the sound echoing through the empty corridors like a metallic lullaby. 3 years I'd been visual merchandising manager here, and still that particular frequency made my teeth ache. But tonight felt different. Tonight the hum seemed more insistent, almost urgent. I should have left with the rest of the staff at closing time. Should have walked out into the Dallas heat and driven straight home to my apartment, where the only thing watching me would be the neighbor's cat through the window. Instead, I found myself drawn back to the men's formal wear section, to window display 3, where he stood. The mannequin had no name. Corporate policy discouraged anthropomorphizing the merchandise, but in my mind, I'd started calling him the Watcher. Not because of his face, which was the same bland, handsome composite that adorned dozens of identical figures throughout the store. It was the way he seemed to absorb attention, drawing the eye with an intensity that had nothing to do with the charcoal Armani suit he wore or the burgundy silk tie knotted precisely at his throat. I'd dressed him myself that morning, positioned him at a 3/4 angle toward the mall entrance, one arm slightly raised as if adjusting a cufflink, the other relaxed at his side. Standard pose 7 from the corporate manual. But now, as the security lights cast long shadows across the sales floor, something was wrong. He was facing the stockroom door. Not obviously. The shift was subtle, maybe 15 degrees counterclockwise. But after 3 years of obsessing over sight lines and customer flow patterns, I could spot a misalignment from 50 feet away. Someone had moved him. Had to be one of the night crew, though I couldn't imagine why. I pulled out my phone and opened the photo I'd taken that afternoon during my final inspection. In the image, the mannequin's gaze was directed toward the entrance, exactly as I'd positioned him. Now he was looking inward, toward the maze of storage rooms and loading docks that formed the store's hidden arteries. The air conditioning kicked on with a mechanical wheeze, and I felt goosebumps rise on my arms despite the stifling Texas heat that would persist well into September. I approached the window display, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the polished floor. Up close, the mannequin looked exactly as I'd left him. The suit hung perfectly, without a wrinkle. The tie sat properly against the starched collar. Even the subtle highlighting powder I'd dusted on his cheekbones to catch the display lights remained precisely applied. Yet something about his expression seemed different, more focused, as if those painted eyes held actual intent. I circled the platform, checking for signs of tampering. The bolts that secured the figure to the base appeared undisturbed. No scuff marks on the platform. Nothing to indicate anyone had been near the display since I'd finished the setup that afternoon. But mannequins don't move themselves. I spent the next 20 minutes adjusting his position, rotating him back to the proper angle. The joints moved smoothly, as they should, offering just enough resistance to hold a pose without being difficult to manipulate. Everything normal. Everything as it should be. Still, I found myself taking extra photos before I left, documenting not just the angle but every detail, the drape of the jacket, the position of each finger, the exact fold of the pocket square. Insurance against my own failing memory, or evidence for whatever was happening here. The next morning brought the usual chaos of opening procedures. Staff arriving with their coffee and complaints about the commute, delivery trucks backing up to the loading dock, the endless stream of maintenance issues that seemed to multiply overnight. I was deep in conversation with Janet from accounting about the quarterly budget projections when something caught my peripheral vision. The Watcher had moved again. This time the shift was more pronounced. He'd rotated almost 30 degrees toward the stockroom, and his raised arm had dropped slightly, as if he'd been caught mid-gesture. My carefully documented photos confirmed what my eyes already knew. This wasn't subtle settling or foundation shift. Someone was deliberately repositioning the figure. I called a meeting with the night security supervisor, a weathered ex-cop named Reynolds, who'd been working retail security longer than I'd been alive. He listened to my concerns with the patient expression of someone who'd heard every possible complaint about the overnight shift. "Could be any number of people," he said, scrolling through his tablet to check the previous night's log. "Cleaning crew, stock team, maintenance. Hell, could even be one of the day shift coming in early. You want me to pull the security footage?" The request seemed reasonable until Reynolds explained that the cameras covering the sales floor had been scheduled for upgrade next month. For now, they were recording at such low resolution that individual faces were barely distinguishable, and the angle of the nearest camera made it impossible to see the window display area clearly. "I can have someone keep an extra eye on that section," he offered, but we both knew how stretched thin the overnight security was. 2 guards for a 3-story department store meant most areas went unchecked for hours at a time. That evening, I decided to take matters into my own hands. After the store closed, I made my usual rounds, then retrieved a small roll of paper tape from the supply cabinet. Working carefully, I applied thin strips to the base of the mannequin's feet, connecting them to the platform in a way that would be invisible to casual observation, but would tear if the figure moved even slightly. I also placed a piece of tape across the junction between the mannequin's right hand and the cuff of his jacket. If someone was manually repositioning him, they'd have to grip him somewhere, and the hand was the most logical point of leverage. The next morning, my heart hammered as I approached window 3. The mannequin had rotated again, almost 45 degrees now, facing the stockroom door directly, but the tape around his feet remained intact, unbroken. The seal on his hand was also undamaged. I stared at the evidence of my own eyes, trying to process what I was seeing. The mannequin had moved, but nothing I'd done to detect tampering showed any sign of interference. Either someone was being incredibly careful to work around my traps, or what? Mannequins don't develop the ability to move independently. The alternative explanations felt even less rational than accepting that someone on the night crew had developed an inexplicable obsession with rearranging my display. But that afternoon brought a discovery that shifted my understanding of the situation entirely. I was adjusting the lighting in window 3 when something caught my attention in my peripheral vision. The tie, the burgundy silk tie I'd so carefully knotted around the mannequin's neck that morning, was missing. I checked the platform, thinking it might have fallen, searched the area around the window display, asked the other visual merchandising staff if they'd removed it for cleaning or replacement. Nothing. The tie had simply vanished. 20 minutes later, I found it in fitting room 7. It was hanging perfectly on one of the wooden hangers, the silk draped as precisely as if it had been pressed and prepared for sale. The knot I'd tied that morning was gone. The tie hung straight and smooth, without a single wrinkle. I stood in the small fitting room, holding the tie and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The fitting rooms were locked after hours. The night crew had no reason to remove merchandise from the displays, and certainly no reason to relocate it to the fitting rooms. And even if they had, why untie it? Why hang it so carefully? The rational explanations felt increasingly hollow. A prank seemed too elaborate and pointless. Theft made no sense. Why steal a tie only to leave it hanging in a fitting room? Even sabotage didn't fit the pattern. There was something almost careful about how the tie had been handled, respectful even. That night I started staying later. Not officially, I clocked out at the usual time, but I found excuses to linger. Paperwork that needed finishing, inventory that needed rechecking, displays that needed minor adjustments. The real reason was that I needed to see what was happening to the watcher. By 10 p.m., the store was officially empty, except for security and the cleaning crew. I positioned myself in the administrative offices on the 2nd floor, where I had a partial view of the sales floor below. The security desk was on the opposite end of the building, and the cleaning crew worked their way through the store systematically, spending about 20 minutes per section. From my vantage point, I could see window 3 clearly, though the mannequin appeared as little more than a silhouette in the dim emergency lighting. I settled in to wait, my eyes fixed on that motionless figure. Nothing happened for the first hour. The cleaning crew worked through cosmetics, then women's accessories. Their vacuum cleaner droned steadily, punctuated by occasional conversation in Spanish that echoed faintly through the store. By midnight, they'd moved on to menswear. I watched them work around the window displays, efficiently mopping and dusting without paying particular attention to the mannequins. When they finished the section and moved on to home goods, I checked the time, 12:47 a.m. The watcher hadn't moved. I was beginning to feel foolish when the air conditioning shut off with its usual mechanical sigh, leaving the store in the kind of complete silence that only empty buildings achieve. In that silence, I heard something that made my skin crawl. Footsteps. Not the heavy boots of security making rounds, or the soft sneakers of the cleaning crew. These were different, measured, deliberate, with a distinct clip of dress shoes on polished floor. They seemed to be coming from the direction of the men's formal wear section. I pressed myself closer to the window, trying to see into the shadows below. The emergency lighting created pools of dim illumination, separated by areas of almost complete darkness. In one of those pools, I could just make out the window displays. The watcher was gone. Not moved. Gone. The platform where he'd stood was empty, though the other mannequins in the surrounding displays remained in their positions. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, trying to get a better view through the camera's digital zoom. The footsteps had stopped. I waited, hardly breathing, straining to see movement in the darkness below. Minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Then, just as I was beginning to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing, I saw him. The watcher was standing near the entrance to the stockroom, no longer on his platform but somehow upright on the sales floor. Even in the dim light, I could see he was still wearing the charcoal Armani suit, though something about his posture looked different, more natural, less rigid than the carefully posed display figure. He was facing the stockroom door, as motionless as he'd been on the platform, but there was an unmistakable sense of purpose in his stance, of waiting. I don't know how long I watched him standing there. Long enough for my legs to cramp from staying motionless. Long enough for doubt to creep in, making me wonder if I was seeing tricks of light and shadow, if stress and sleep deprivation were finally catching up with me. Then he moved. Not the jerky, mechanical movement you'd expect from something that shouldn't be able to move at all. This was fluid, natural, human. He turned toward the stockroom door, reached for the handle and pushed it open. The door, which should have been locked, swung open silently. He stepped through, and the door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow carried clearly through the quiet store. I sat in the darkness of the administrative office, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible. Mannequins were fiberglass and plastic. They didn't walk, didn't open doors, didn't develop apparent interests in stockroom areas. But I'd seen what I'd seen. The next morning, the watcher was back on his platform in window 3, posed exactly as I'd left him the previous afternoon. The burgundy tie was knotted perfectly at his throat. There was no sign that he'd ever been anywhere else. I spent the day in a haze of exhaustion and mounting paranoia. Every colleague who spoke to me seemed to be studying my face too carefully. Every casual question about how I was feeling carried an undercurrent of concern that suggested they'd noticed something wrong with my behavior. Maybe they had. Maybe I was projecting my own growing doubts about my sanity onto their innocent interactions. The line between rational skepticism and delusional thinking was becoming harder to locate. That afternoon, I made a decision that in hindsight seems both inevitable and completely insane. I was going to confront whatever was happening directly. I stayed in the store after closing, but this time I didn't hide in the administrative offices. I positioned myself in the men's formal wear section, sitting in one of the leather chairs we'd arranged near the fitting rooms. If the watcher was going to move, he'd have to do it in front of me. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. Every small sound, the building settling, the air conditioning cycling on and off, the distant hum of the security system, seemed amplified in the darkness. I found myself staring at the mannequin so intently that my eyes began to water, but I didn't dare blink for more than a few seconds at a time. Around 2 a.m., something changed. It started with the smell, faint at first, but gradually growing stronger. It was the scent of expensive cologne, the kind that came in small bottles with prices that made most people wince. But underneath that was something else, something organic and warm that reminded me of skin, of breath, of life. The temperature in the immediate area seemed to drop by several degrees, not dramatically, but enough that I could see my breath when I exhaled. The mannequin remained motionless on his platform, but I had the growing sensation that I was no longer alone in my vigil, that I was being watched in return. I turned slowly in my chair, scanning the shadows around me. Nothing visible, but the feeling persisted and intensified. Something was studying me with the same obsessive attention I'd been directing at the window display. The scrutiny felt almost physical, like fingers trailing across my skin. When I turned back to face the mannequin, he was looking directly at me. Not toward me. At me. Those painted eyes, which should have been focused on some middle distance, had somehow acquired the ability to track movement, to hold a gaze. The bland, handsome face I'd stared at countless times now seemed to hold an expression of mild curiosity. I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't respond properly. Not paralyzed exactly, but weak and unsteady, as if I'd been sitting in that chair for hours instead of minutes. The mannequin continued to regard me with that patient, interested expression. Then he smiled. It was a subtle expression, just a slight upward curve of those sculpted lips, but it transformed his entire appearance. The face that had seemed generically attractive now looked specifically pleased, as if he'd been waiting for this moment of acknowledgement between us. He stepped down from the platform with the easy grace of someone accustomed to fine clothing and formal occasions. Up close, the details that had seemed artificial under the display lighting appeared remarkably natural. The suit fit him perfectly because it was his suit, tailored to his specific measurements. The tie complemented his coloring because he'd chosen it himself. The burgundy silk that had appeared so mysteriously in the fitting room. He walked toward me with measured steps, and I noticed he cast no reflection in the polished floor tiles. His shoes made no sound, but the scent of cologne grew stronger, and I could see the fine details of his face with impossible clarity. The slight asymmetry that made his features interesting rather than perfect. The way his eyes seemed to catch light that wasn't there. When he was close enough that I could have reached out and touched the fabric of his jacket, he spoke. His voice was cultured, with the kind of accent that suggested expensive private schools and old money, but there was something underneath it, something that didn't quite fit with the sophisticated appearance. A quality that reminded me of static electricity, of audio recordings played at slightly the wrong speed. What he said was simple. "You've been watching me." It wasn't a question or an accusation, just a statement of fact, delivered with the same mild curiosity his expression had held. I tried to respond, but my voice wouldn't work properly. The words came out as barely audible whispers, and I realized that my throat felt tight, as if something were pressing against it, as if invisible fingers were testing the distance from jaw to collarbone. He tilted his head slightly, still smiling that subtle smile. "I've been watching you too. Did you know that you adjust your tie 17 times during an average shift? Always the same motion, thumb and forefinger, slight tug to the left. It's quite distinctive." I looked down at my own tie, suddenly conscious of the gesture he'd described. How many times had I stood in front of window 3, unconsciously mimicking the motion I'd seen reflected in his pose? "The night crew thinks you're having a breakdown," he continued conversationally. "They've been talking about it during their breaks, debating whether someone should speak to management about your behavior. Reynolds from security is particularly concerned. He thinks you might be developing an obsession with the store, with staying late, watching the displays." The information hit me like cold water. Of course they'd been watching me. Of course my increasingly erratic behavior had been noted and discussed. I was the one who'd been acting strangely, not some impossible animated mannequin. But then how was he talking to me now? "You're wondering about the mechanics," he observed, as if reading my thoughts. "How any of this is possible. Whether you're losing your mind, or if there's some logical explanation you haven't considered." He moved closer, and I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood freeze. In the darkened fitting room mirrors behind him, I could see my own reflection clearly, sitting alone in the leather chair, apparently having a conversation with empty air. The mannequin wasn't there. The well-dressed figure standing 3 feet away from me cast no reflection, left no trace of his presence in any of the reflective surfaces scattered throughout the department, which meant either he wasn't really there, or I wasn't seeing what I thought I was seeing. "The question," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "is what you plan to do with this knowledge. Whether you're going to continue this nocturnal surveillance, or if you're going to accept that some things are better left unexamined." I found my voice at last, though it came out rougher than I'd expected. "What are you?" His smile widened slightly, but didn't become any warmer. "I'm exactly what I appear to be, a well-dressed gentleman with an interest in fine clothing and proper presentation. Someone who appreciates attention to detail and takes pride in appearance." He paused, studying my face with that same patient curiosity. "The difference is that I don't require sleep, or food, or any of the other biological necessities that limit human observation. I can watch, and wait, and learn, without interruption." The implications of what he was saying sank in slowly. How long had he been watching? Not just me, but everyone who worked in the store. What had he learned during those long hours when the building was empty except for the occasional security patrol? "The fitting rooms are quite revealing," he mentioned casually. "People assume they're private, but privacy is really just a matter of perspective. If you know how to be still, how to be patient, you can observe so much about human nature. The little vanities, the insecurities, the way people behave when they think no one is watching." I thought about all the times I'd used those fitting rooms myself, trying on clothes during my lunch breaks or after hours. The assumption of privacy, of being alone with just fabric and mirrors and fluorescent lighting. Never alone. Always watched. "You've been in the mirrors," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "In all of them. The whole time." He didn't confirm or deny it, just maintained that pleasant, interested expression, but I knew I was right. Every reflective surface in the store, windows, mirrors, even the polished fixtures, they were all potential vantage points for someone who could exist in the spaces between observation and reality. "The renovation starts Monday," I said, thinking about the planned upgrade to the window displays. "You'll be moved to storage." For the first time, his expression shifted to something that might have been concern. "Will I? That depends entirely on whether you mention any of this to the renovation crew, whether you suggest that certain precautions might be advisable when handling the merchandise." I understood the threat implicit in his words, my silence in exchange for his cooperation. No reports of impossible moving mannequins, no requests for security camera upgrades focused on the window displays. In return, he'd allow himself to be relocated without incident. But what happened after the renovation was complete? When the new displays were installed and the updated lighting created new angles, new shadows, new opportunities for observation? "I think," he said, as if reading my thoughts again, "that you'll find the new visual merchandising quite engaging. There are so many possibilities for creative arrangement, so many ways to position things for optimal viewing." He took a step backward, his form already seeming to fade slightly around the edges. "We should both return to our proper places before the cleaning crew finishes their rounds. They'll be in this section again within the hour." I blinked, and he was gone. Not walked away or moved back to his platform, simply absent, as if he'd never been there at all. But the scent of expensive cologne lingered in the air, and when I looked at window 3, the mannequin was back in his position, facing slightly toward the stockroom door with that same expression of patient interest. I sat in the leather chair until dawn, watching him watch the empty stockroom entrance, trying to process what had happened, whether any of it had been real, whether the stress of the job and the isolation of working late hours had finally pushed me past some invisible boundary between rational thought and delusion. When the morning shift arrived, I was still sitting there, staring at the display window. Janet from accounting found me and asked if I was feeling all right, if maybe I should go home early and get some rest. I told her I was fine, just thinking about the renovation plans. She looked at me with the same concerned expression I'd been seeing more and more often lately, the one that suggested people were starting to worry about my mental state. Maybe they were right to worry, but as I gathered my things to leave, I caught sight of something that stopped me cold. In the corner of window 3, partially hidden behind the mannequin's platform, was a small piece of paper. When I retrieved it, I found 5 fingerprints pressed into the surface. Not dust prints or smudges, but clear, deliberate marks that looked like someone had been testing the pressure needed to leave an impression. 5 fingers at exactly throat height. I folded the paper carefully and put it in my pocket, then walked out of the store into the blazing Dallas heat. Behind me, I could feel the weight of painted eyes tracking my movement until I was out of sight. The renovation begins Monday. 3 days to decide whether to report what I'd experienced or to accept that some observations are better left unshared. 3 days to figure out whether I was losing my mind or whether I'd stumbled into something far more disturbing than simple insanity. Either way, I know I'll be back tomorrow night, and the night after that, because regardless of what's real and what's delusion, the watcher is expecting me, and I've never been very good at disappointing an audience. Story 13. Each of the first triangle appeared 3 days after he left. 3 blue picks, stacked with surgical precision on top of my Marshall amp, their edges aligned so perfectly they seemed to mock the chaos of cables and beer bottles scattered across my practice space. I'd been playing alone for hours, working through riffs that still felt incomplete without his bass lines threading underneath, and when I finally looked up from the fretboard, there they were. I told myself someone had been in the garage, maybe the landlord, checking the water heater that groaned behind my drum kit. Maybe one of the guys from the other bands who rented space in the complex. But as I reached for the picks, my fingers hesitated. They were the exact shade of blue as the ones he'd used, that electric cobalt that caught stage lights like tiny fragments of sky. The weight felt identical in my palm, the worn texture familiar against my thumb. The second triangle materialized inside my bass case 2 weeks later. I'd opened it to grab my backup cables before a gig at Murphy's Tavern, and there they sat in the velvet compartment where I kept my tuner. Same configuration, same impossible precision. The case had been locked, sitting in my bedroom closet since our last show together 4 months ago. I stood there for a full minute, listening to the blood rush behind my ears, before scooping them up and shoving them into my pocket. During sound check that night, I found myself scanning the small crowd that had gathered early, searching faces for one that couldn't possibly be there. The other guys in my current band, temporary arrangements really, session players who knew their parts but not the spaces between them, kept glancing at me as I adjusted and readjusted my amp settings, chasing a tone that had walked out of my life without explanation. The club's basement ceiling hung low enough that I had to duck when moving between my pedal board and the mic stand. Moisture beaded on the exposed pipes overhead, and the air tasted of spilled beer and something else, something metallic that reminded me of the way his fingers smelled after long practice sessions, like copper and electricity. Halfway through our third song, I noticed the picks scattered across the floor near the foot of the stage. Not arranged this time, just dropped casually, as if someone had been playing and let them fall. 5 or 6 blue ones mixed with the usual suspects, black, white, tortoiseshell. But I'd been watching the small crowd, and nobody had thrown anything. Nobody had even been close enough. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing inward with each downbeat. I caught myself looking toward the sound booth where he used to stand during our sets, arms crossed, nodding along to rhythms only he could feel. The space stood empty now, just shadows and the red glow of the board's LED meters. After the show, I stayed behind while the others loaded out, crawling around the sticky floor on my hands and knees, collecting every blue pick I could find. 17 in total. I counted them twice, then wrapped them in a bar napkin and slipped them into my guitar case. The third triangle appeared in my car. I'd stopped at a gas station on the way home from practice, and when I returned with coffee and a sleeve of crackers, they were sitting on my dashboard in that same perfect formation, impossible geometry in a locked vehicle. My hands shook as I turned the key in the ignition, and I drove the rest of the way home with the radio off, listening to the engine's rhythm and trying not to look at the rearview mirror. That night, I pulled out all the pics I'd collected and spread them across my kitchen table. 43 blue ones, each identical except for microscopic variations in wear patterns. Some showed the telltale groove marks from aggressive downstrokes. Others had been worried smooth by nervous fingers during long conversations about chord progressions and song structures. I recognized a few, or thought I did. Memory could be a liar when it wanted to be. I tried calling him again. Listening to the mechanical voice informed me that the number was no longer in service. I'd called dozens of times since he'd left, always getting the same result. His social media accounts had gone dark the day before he disappeared. No farewell posts, no forwarding information. Just an absence that seemed to echo in the spaces where his presence used to vibrate. The triangles began appearing more frequently after that. I'd find them in the most unlikely places, balanced on top of my coffee maker in the morning, nestled in the groove of my car's cup holder, arranged on the windowsill in my bedroom. Always three, always blue, always positioned with mathematical precision that seemed to mock human capability. I started documenting them, taking photos before disturbing each arrangement. The pictures never quite captured what I saw with my naked eyes. The pics appeared duller in the digital images, their edges less sharp, their positioning more random than the perfect triangles I remembered. I began to question my own perception, wondering if I was imposing patterns where none existed, seeing significance in coincidence. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It started as a peripheral awareness during practice sessions, that prickling sensation between my shoulder blades that made me turn around to check empty corners. Then it expanded, following me to grocery stores and coffee shops, a constant pressure just outside my field of vision. I'd catch myself checking reflections in windows and mirrors, scanning crowds for a face that logic told me wouldn't be there. The other musicians I played with began to notice changes in my playing. My timing had always been solid, reliable as a metronome, but now I found myself rushing certain passages while dragging through others. During a recording session at a studio downtown, the engineer kept asking me to redo takes, claiming he could hear fluctuations in tempo that didn't show up on the click track. "You seem distracted," he said through the control room speakers. "Everything okay?" I wanted to tell him about the picks, about the triangles, about the way my amplifier sometimes seemed to hum melodies I'd never written, but somehow recognized. Instead, I mumbled something about being tired and asked for another take. The Cleveland show happened on a Tuesday night in October. The venue was exactly the kind of place we used to love, a converted basement with exposed brick walls and a ceiling so low that the tallest audience members had to stoop. The sound was muddy and alive, the kind of acoustics that turned every note into a small act of rebellion against proper audio engineering. We were 3 songs into our set when it happened. I'd been playing the bridge to an old composition, one he'd helped arrange back when we still believed our band might amount to something more than weekend bar gigs, when the D string snapped with a sound like a gunshot. But not just any part of the bridge, the exact moment where his bass line used to drop out, leaving my guitar exposed and vulnerable. The timing was so precise it felt deliberate, orchestrated. The string didn't simply break. It exploded at the bridge, metal fragments catching the stage lights as they scattered across the floor. I stood there with my guitar hanging silent while the other instruments continued for a few measures, before gradually fading to silence. The small crowd shifted uncomfortably, waiting for me to grab a backup instrument or restring quickly. But I couldn't move. I was staring at my clip-on tuner, watching its LED display cycle through a pattern I'd never seen before. The letters weren't random. They spelled out his initial, the first letter of the name I'd stopped saying out loud months ago. DANIEL, over and over, in a rhythm that matched the tempo of the song we'd been playing. But that was impossible. Tuners responded to frequencies, not intentions. They displayed note names based on mathematical relationships between sound waves, not memories or grief or whatever madness was crawling through my brain. The audience began to murmur. Someone coughed. A beer bottle clinked against a table in the back. Normal sounds, human sounds, but they felt muffled and distant, as if I were hearing them through water. I forced myself to move, switching to my backup guitar and finishing the set on autopilot. My fingers found the familiar chord shapes, but my mind kept circling back to that display, those letters cycling through their impossible sequence. After our last song, I packed up quickly, avoiding eye contact with the other band members who kept trying to make conversation about the string break, calling it crazy luck, 1 in a million timing. The drive home took 3 hours, and I spent most of it checking my rearview mirror. Not because I thought anyone was following me, but because I'd started seeing movement in my peripheral vision. Shadows that shifted when I wasn't looking directly at them. Shapes that resolved into nothing when I turned my head. I pulled over at a rest stop halfway home, sitting in my idling car while late-night truckers moved through the fluorescent-lit parking lot like sleepwalkers. That's when I found the note. It was tucked under my windshield wiper, folded once, the paper soft with moisture. My name was written across the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. Too careful, too precise, as if someone had taken great care to disguise their natural script. The message inside was brief. The triangles mark the intersections. You've been standing at the crossroads for months without seeing them. Some departures aren't voluntary. Some silences aren't chosen. Look closer at what you've been collecting. I read it 3 times before the words began to blur. My hands were shaking badly enough that I had to grip the steering wheel to steady them. The parking lot suddenly felt too exposed, too bright. I crumpled the note and shoved it into my jacket pocket. But I could still feel its weight against my chest, like a small accusation. Back home, I spread every blue pick I'd collected across my living room floor. 78 of them now, each one a small mystery I'd been afraid to examine too closely. Under the harsh overhead light, I began to notice details I'd missed before. Tiny scratches that could have been letters, wear patterns that might have spelled out words, microscopic gouges that resembled musical notation when viewed from certain angles. But the more I stared, the less certain I became of what I was seeing. Were those deliberate markings, or was I reading meaning into random damage? Was that combination of scratches really his initials? Or was I imposing familiar patterns onto chaos because my mind couldn't accept the alternative? I gathered them up and returned them to their shoebox, but even sealed away, I could feel their presence in the room. They seemed to pulse with potential energy, like batteries waiting to discharge, or seeds preparing to germinate into something I didn't want to name. Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams of stages that stretched impossibly long, and audiences that watched from shadows I couldn't penetrate. In the deepest part of the night, I woke to the sound of music drifting up from somewhere below my apartment, bass lines that felt familiar, chord progressions I'd heard before but couldn't quite place. I pressed my ear to the floor, listening to melodies that might have been memories or might have been the building's old pipes settling in the cold. The music continued for what felt like hours, always just at the edge of recognition, always just too faint to be certain it was really there. When morning came, I found a new triangle waiting on my kitchen counter. 3 blue picks arranged with that same impossible precision, their edges aligned perfectly despite the fact that I'd locked every door and window before going to bed. This time, though, something was different. A small piece of paper was tucked underneath the bottom pick, so thin I almost missed it. Another message, in that same careful handwriting. The triangles aren't random. They mark the places where the music gets thin, where one reality bleeds through to another. You've been playing our songs wrong since I left. The arrangements were never complete. They were instructions. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, staring at the picks and the note while coffee grew cold in my mug. Outside, the ordinary world continued its ordinary business. Cars passing on the street, neighbors leaving for work, dogs barking at invisible threats. But inside my apartment, the triangles waited with patient geometry, marking intersections I'd never learned to navigate, spelling out messages in a language I'd never been taught to read. The question wasn't whether they were real. The question was what they wanted me to understand, and whether I had the courage to keep listening to their silent music long enough to learn what I'd been missing all along. I picked up my phone and scrolled to his contact information one more time. The number that no longer worked, the silence that had lasted for months. But this time, instead of calling, I opened a voice message and began to speak. "I found your triangles," I said to the empty room. "I don't know what they mean, but I'm listening. If you're trying to tell me something, if you're trying to come back through the music somehow, I'm here. I've been here all along." I hit send before I could second-guess myself, watching the message disappear into digital void. Then I sat back and waited, surrounded by blue triangles and unanswered questions, while somewhere in the distance, almost too faint to hear, bass lines continued to play melodies I'd never learned to finish.